Wisdom begins where comfort collapses. Stone remembers what living minds deliberately erased. Impossible monuments, forbidden symbols, unexplained disappearances, impossible precision. Every fragment quietly accuses accepted narratives of hiding something immense. Continue carefully, because each unfolding mystery dismantles familiar assumptions, replacing confidence with breathtaking uncertainty and unforgettable dread forever. The warm air of Babylon drifted slowly through the palace courtyards, carrying the scent of cedar wood, oil lamps, and the nearby Euphrates. Marble floors reflected the flickering glow of torches as servants moved quietly through shadowed halls. Outside, thousands of soldiers waited for orders that would never come. Inside, the most successful conqueror of the ancient world lay confined to his bed, growing weaker with each passing day. In the early summer of 323 BC, Alexander the Great stood at the height of his power. His empire stretched from Greece to the edges of India, connecting cultures that had rarely encountered one another before. He had survived countless battles, dangerous marches across deserts and mountains, assassination attempts, and wounds that would have killed many other men. Yet, after returning to Babylon to prepare for another ambitious campaign, something changed. According to several ancient sources, Alexander attended a banquet hosted by one of his companions. The evening was filled with wine, conversation, and plans for future conquests. Soon afterward, he reportedly developed a fever. Over the following days, the illness worsened. Although he continued discussing military matters and issuing commands, his strength steadily faded until he could no longer speak. Ancient historians describe a gradual decline rather than a sudden collapse. Plutarch, Arrian, Diodorus, and Quintus Curtius Rufus each preserved versions of the final days, but none agreed on every detail. Some emphasized the fever. Others mentioned severe pain, weakness, or an inability to move. Their differences have fueled centuries of debate. The most widely accepted explanation today points toward natural illness. Babylon was surrounded by marshlands where infectious diseases flourished. Malaria has long been considered a possibility, while typhoid fever has gained support because several reported symptoms resemble modern medical descriptions. Other scholars have proposed pneumonia, pancreatitis brought on by heavy drinking, complications from old battle wounds, or even a rare neurological disorder such as Guillain-Barré syndrome. Yet the mystery deepens because the historical evidence remains frustratingly incomplete. Ancient medical terminology often described symptoms rather than specific diseases. Accounts were written years, sometimes centuries, after Alexander's death, relying upon earlier records that no longer survive. Every diagnosis must therefore reconstruct events through fragments filtered by memory, politics, and legend. That uncertainty has kept another possibility alive: poisoning. The theory emerged almost immediately after Alexander died. His sudden absence transformed the balance of power across the empire. Generals who had once followed his commands quickly became rivals, dividing territories and building kingdoms of their own. Such dramatic political consequences naturally encouraged suspicions that someone had hastened his death. Ancient writers occasionally mentioned poison, although many dismissed the accusation. Some stories claimed that a powerful toxin had been secretly delivered in water carried from a remote spring. Others suggested that influential figures at court feared Alexander's increasingly unpredictable ambitions, or worried he intended to replace trusted commanders. Still, others pointed toward members of his inner circle, whose motives have been debated ever since. Modern researchers remain cautious. Many poisons known in antiquity acted too quickly to match the prolonged illness described in surviving accounts. However, advocates of the poisoning theory have proposed slower-acting plant toxins such as white hellebore, whose symptoms can resemble natural disease. While intriguing, no physical evidence survives to confirm or reject such ideas. An equally curious detail surrounds Alexander's body after death. Later traditions claimed that it showed remarkably little sign of decay for several days, leading some ancient observers to believe he possessed divine qualities. Others have suggested a far simpler explanation. Certain illnesses can produce paralysis while leaving a patient conscious, making it difficult for ancient physicians to determine the exact moment of death. If that possibility held any truth, it would add another haunting layer to an already extraordinary story. More than 2,000 years later, no medical examination can settle the question. Alexander's tomb itself remains one of antiquity's greatest missing treasures, and without his remains, every theory rests upon scattered texts, careful interpretation, and educated speculation. The conqueror who redrew the map of the ancient world may have fallen to disease, political intrigue, an unfortunate combination of both, or something entirely unforeseen. His final days remain suspended between history and mystery, leaving one enduring question echoing through the centuries. What truly brought the world's greatest conqueror to an unexpected end? If Alexander's final illness remains impossible to explain with complete confidence, then one question naturally follows, lingering like an echo through the empty halls of Babylon. What if the greatest conqueror of the ancient world did not simply die? What if someone helped bring about his end? In the fading light of evening, the ruins of Babylon still seem to hold their breath. Crumbling walls rise from the plain, while broken bricks stamped with royal inscriptions lie scattered beneath centuries of dust. Somewhere within these vast ceremonial complexes, Alexander spent his final days surrounded by loyal companions, ambitious generals, court officials, physicians, and servants. Every corridor concealed whispered conversations. Every banquet gathered men whose futures depended upon a single life. It was a setting where triumph and suspicion could exist side by side. By the summer of 323 BC, Alexander had achieved what few rulers had ever imagined possible. His empire stretched across thousands of miles, linking Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and lands reaching toward India. Yet immense success brought equally immense uncertainty. Unlike many monarchs before him, Alexander had not established a clear adult heir capable of immediately succeeding him. His wife, Roxana, was pregnant, but her child had not yet been born. His half-brother Aridaeus suffered from significant physical and intellectual limitations. If Alexander suddenly disappeared, the empire would have no obvious leader. That political reality lies at the center of the poisoning theory. Throughout history, unexplained royal deaths have often inspired rumors of conspiracy. Ancient kingdoms revolved around powerful individuals, and removing a single ruler could transform the balance of power overnight. Alexander's death created exactly such a vacuum. Within months, his senior commanders began dividing territories among themselves. Decades of conflict followed as former allies became rivals, each seeking control over different regions of the empire. To later observers, the consequences appeared almost too convenient. Several ancient writers preserved stories suggesting Alexander had been deliberately poisoned. These accounts, however, were written years or even centuries after the event, and often reflected political traditions rather than eyewitness testimony. One recurring narrative claimed that a deadly poison had been secretly administered during a banquet attended by trusted companions. Another alleged that influential figures within the Macedonian court feared Alexander's increasingly unpredictable ambitions, and decided that removing him offered the safest path forward. One name appears repeatedly within these traditions: Antipater, the powerful governor whom Alexander had left in Macedonia. According to later accounts, relations between the two men had become increasingly strained. Some stories suggest Alexander intended to replace him upon returning west. If true, such a decision would have threatened Antipater's authority and perhaps even his family's future. The accusations did not stop there. Certain ancient traditions claimed that Antipater's son, Iollas, who served as Alexander's cupbearer, delivered the fatal drink. Others implicated Cassander, another of Antipater's sons, who would later become one of the most influential rulers of the Hellenistic world. These stories formed a dramatic chain of events in which political calculation outweighed personal loyalty. Yet, there is a significant problem. Nearly every accusation emerged after years of political upheaval, during a period when Alexander's former generals fought one another in brutal wars. Blaming rivals for the king's death could strengthen political legitimacy, justify revenge, or reshape public memory. Ancient historians themselves often questioned these accounts, noting that many appeared to be fueled more by rumor than evidence. Medical evidence presents another challenge. Most poisons known during the 4th century BC acted relatively quickly. Many caused violent vomiting, convulsions, or rapid collapse. The surviving descriptions of Alexander's illness, although inconsistent, generally portray a gradual decline lasting roughly 10 to 12 days. That timeline has led many modern physicians to favor infectious disease over assassination. Still, the possibility cannot be dismissed entirely. Researchers have proposed that certain plant-based toxins available in antiquity could produce slower symptoms. White hellebore is often mentioned because it can trigger prolonged weakness, digestive distress, irregular heartbeat, and progressive physical decline. Other poisonous plants from the Mediterranean world possessed equally complex effects that ancient physicians may not have fully understood. Whether any of these substances match the historical descriptions remains a matter of continuing debate. Some scholars have explored another intriguing possibility. Instead of a single lethal poison, Alexander may have suffered from a combination of factors. Years of relentless campaigning had left him physically exhausted. Numerous battle wounds never fully healed. Long marches through harsh climates, repeated illnesses, emotional strain, and heavy drinking may all have weakened his body. Under such conditions, even a relatively mild toxin or an ordinary infection could have produced devastating consequences. The mystery becomes even more fascinating because nearly every surviving source tells the story differently. Plutarch showed skepticism toward poisoning claims. Arrian largely favored natural illness. Diodorus preserved conflicting traditions without fully endorsing either. As generations passed, storytellers expanded the narrative further, introducing secret plots, hidden messages, mysterious substances, and elaborate betrayals that may reveal more about human imagination than historical reality. Modern forensic science, so effective in solving recent mysteries, offers little help here. Alexander's body has never been conclusively identified. His lost tomb remains one of archaeology's greatest unanswered questions. Without physical remains, researchers cannot conduct toxicological tests, examine preserved tissues, or search for chemical traces that might settle the debate once and for all. Instead, historians are left studying fragile manuscripts copied across centuries, comparing subtle differences in wording, evaluating political motives, and reconstructing events from incomplete evidence. Every surviving text becomes another fragment in a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Perhaps that is why the poisoning theory continues to endure. It is not merely a question about how Alexander died, but about the fragile nature of power itself. Did the conqueror who defeated mighty kingdoms ultimately fall to an invisible illness carried by nature, or to invisible enemies standing only a few steps away? Somewhere between those competing possibilities lies a truth that has remained hidden for more than 2,000 years, waiting for evidence that may never emerge. If the truth behind Alexander's death remains hidden behind centuries of conflicting testimony, another mystery quietly emerges from the silence that followed. What exactly had the conqueror intended to do next? When his voice faded in Babylon, did an even greater vision disappear with him? A weathered clay tablet rests beneath museum glass, covered in tiny, wedge-shaped impressions pressed into soft earth more than 2,000 years ago. Nearby lie fragments of royal correspondence, administrative records, and military inventories recovered from Mesopotamia. Together, they offer fleeting glimpses into the machinery of Alexander's vast empire. Yet, among these surviving documents, one thing is noticeably absent. No complete record of his final strategy has ever been found. When Alexander entered Babylon in 323 BC, he did not behave like a man preparing for the end of his life. Ancient accounts describe a ruler consumed with planning. Engineers surveyed rivers and canals. Shipbuilders assembled an enormous fleet. Officials organized supplies arriving from every corner of the empire. Messengers traveled constantly between distant provinces. Rather than slowing down after years of relentless conquest, Alexander appeared ready to begin another extraordinary chapter. The clearest objective involved Arabia. Several ancient historians agree that Alexander intended to launch a major expedition into the Arabian Peninsula. Unlike many neighboring regions, much of Arabia remained outside his direct control. Its prosperous trading networks carried incense, spices, precious metals, and luxury goods across the ancient world. Securing these routes promised both immense wealth and strategic influence over commerce connecting Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean. Preparations seemed to support this goal. Harbors along the Persian Gulf were expanded. New ships were constructed using timber gathered from distant forests. Exploratory voyages mapped coastlines that had previously been little known to the Macedonians. These activities suggest careful planning rather than vague ambition. But Arabia may have represented only the beginning. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence comes from a document known as the Last Plans, preserved by the ancient historian Diodorus Siculus. According to his account, Alexander left behind an astonishing collection of future projects. These included building thousands of warships, constructing monumental temples unlike anything the ancient world had seen, creating roads linking vast regions of the empire, and launching campaigns farther west toward Carthage and perhaps even Italy. If authentic, these plans reveal a ruler whose ambitions had expanded far beyond simple conquest. They suggest someone attempting to reshape the political, cultural, and economic landscape of the known world on an unprecedented scale. Yet, almost immediately, doubts begin to appear. Many historians question whether these remarkable plans genuinely originated with Alexander himself. The document survives only through later writers, and no original version has ever been discovered. Some scholars argue that the proposals seem almost impossibly grand, exceeding even Alexander's extraordinary appetite for expansion. Others believe they may have been compiled after his death by loyal supporters seeking to magnify his legacy or justify future political decisions. The timing also raises difficult questions. After Alexander died, his generals gathered to determine the future of the empire. According to several ancient sources, many of the proposed projects were quickly abandoned. Officially, they were considered too expensive, too ambitious, or simply unrealistic. Yet, some researchers wonder whether practical concerns tell the entire story. Could rejecting these plans have also prevented any single successor from claiming Alexander's unfinished vision as a source of legitimacy? Another possibility is even more elusive. What if Alexander never produced a single master plan at all? Throughout his campaigns, he often adapted rapidly to changing circumstances, responding to opportunities as they emerged. His empire expanded through constant improvisation as much as careful preparation. Perhaps later generations, searching for order after the sudden collapse of centralized authority, imagined a comprehensive blueprint that had never truly existed. Then there are the more speculative theories. Some writers have suggested that confidential documents describing Alexander's intentions may still lie undiscovered within buried archives somewhere in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or Macedonia. Others imagine that records were deliberately destroyed during the violent struggles among his successors, eliminating evidence that could strengthen a rival's claim to power. Although no convincing proof supports these ideas, the disappearance of countless ancient libraries and administrative centers reminds us how much historical knowledge has already been lost. The mystery ultimately extends beyond military campaigns or architectural projects. It touches upon one of history's greatest unanswered questions. How different might the ancient world have become had Alexander lived another decade? Would Arabia have fallen under Macedonian rule? Would expeditions have reached Carthage, Italy, or lands still farther beyond the Mediterranean? Or were these magnificent visions simply legends created after his death, reflecting dreams that existed only in the imaginations of later generations? Without the missing records, or perhaps the missing tomb itself, the conqueror's final intentions remain suspended between documented history and enduring mystery. If Alexander's unfinished ambitions dissolved into uncertainty, his physical legacy proved even more elusive. The conqueror who reshaped the ancient world did not simply leave behind unanswered plans. In time, he seemed to leave behind no resting place at all. Sunlight filters through the broken columns of ancient Alexandria, casting long shadows across buried streets hidden beneath the modern city. Far below layers of stone, sand, and centuries of rebuilding lie fragments of palaces, temples, and royal districts that once stood beside the Mediterranean. Somewhere within this lost landscape, according to generations of historians, rested one of the most famous bodies in human history. Yet today, no confirmed trace of Alexander the Great's tomb has ever been found. The disappearance is especially remarkable because Alexander's burial was anything but secret. Following his death in Babylon in 323 BC, his body was carefully preserved using techniques that impressed even later writers. Ancient sources describe an elaborate funeral carriage unlike anything seen before, decorated with gold, precious metals, carved figures, and intricate engineering. The procession itself became a symbol of imperial authority, carrying not only the remains of a king, but also the future of an empire that had suddenly lost its center. Originally, Alexander may have wished to be buried at the sanctuary of Zeus Ammon in the Siwa oasis of Egypt, where he had once been welcomed as the son of the god. Other traditions suggest Macedonia remained the intended destination, where generations of his ancestors had been laid to rest. Whatever the original plan, events took an unexpected turn before the journey was complete. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted generals and the future ruler of Egypt, intercepted the funeral procession. Rather than allowing the body to continue toward Macedonia, he brought it to Egypt, recognizing that possession of Alexander's remains carried enormous political significance. In the ancient world, controlling the burial place of a legendary ruler could strengthen claims to legitimacy as effectively as commanding armies. At first, the body appears to have been placed in Memphis. Later, it was transferred to Alexandria, the magnificent city Alexander himself had founded only a few years earlier. There, according to numerous ancient writers, his tomb became one of the most celebrated monuments of the Hellenistic world. Remarkably, several famous visitors are believed to have seen it with their own eyes. Julius Caesar is thought to have visited the tomb during his time in Alexandria. The Roman Emperor Augustus reportedly paid his respects and, according to one enduring tradition, accidentally damaged Alexander's nose while placing a golden crown upon the preserved body. Other Roman emperors, including Caligula, Caracalla, and Septimius Severus, were also associated with visits to the tomb, sometimes removing treasured objects as relics or symbols of imperial prestige. For centuries, the location seemed widely known. Then, gradually, the historical record grows quiet. By the 4th century AD, references become increasingly rare. Political upheaval transformed Alexandria. Earthquakes struck the city repeatedly. Tsunamis reshaped sections of the coastline. Fires, invasions, religious conflict, and constant rebuilding altered the ancient landscape beyond recognition. Entire districts disappeared beneath rubble or rising sea levels. Buildings, once famous throughout the Mediterranean, faded into memory. At some point, Alexander's tomb simply vanished from recorded history. Since then, countless searches have attempted to relocate it. Archaeologists have explored royal districts buried beneath modern Alexandria, investigated ancient cemeteries, and examined submerged ruins offshore. Several discoveries have briefly sparked excitement, only to fall short of providing convincing evidence. Even today, excavations continue to reveal forgotten structures beneath the city, reminding researchers how much of ancient Alexandria remains inaccessible beneath modern streets and buildings. Alongside these scientific efforts, more speculative theories continue to circulate. Some suggest the tomb was deliberately concealed during periods of political instability to protect it from looters. Others believe the body may have been secretly relocated to another site long before the city's decline. A few even propose that later rulers intentionally erased its location, allowing Alexander's memory to become symbolic rather than tied to a single place. None of these ideas has been confirmed, but each reflects the remarkable absence left by such a famous burial. The irony is difficult to ignore. One of history's most recognizable figures, whose victories transformed continents and whose name filled countless ancient chronicles, may now rest in a place no living person can identify. Somewhere beneath Alexandria's crowded streets, beneath collapsed monuments, forgotten foundations, or layers of shifting earth, the final resting place of Alexander the Great may still wait in silence, preserving one of antiquity's greatest secrets for whoever, if anyone, is destined to uncover it. If Alexander's own resting place disappeared into silence, the mystery surrounding his family begins much earlier. Long before the conqueror inherited an empire, another sudden death changed the course of history forever. Without it, Alexander himself might never have become king. Morning light spills across the stone theater at Aegi, the ancient ceremonial capital of Macedonia. Tier upon tier of weathered seats rises above the hillside, overlooking the remains of royal buildings where kings once celebrated victories, forged alliances, and planned campaigns. The stage is empty now. Wind moves through broken columns, carrying only echoes. Yet, more than 2,000 years ago, this quiet place witnessed one of antiquity's most shocking assassinations. It was the autumn of 336 BC. Philip II of Macedon had transformed his kingdom from a vulnerable regional power into the dominant force of Greece. Through military innovation, diplomacy, and relentless ambition, he defeated rival states and united much of the Greek world under his leadership. Even greater plans lay ahead. Preparations were nearly complete for a massive campaign against the Persian Empire, a war that promised wealth, revenge, and lasting glory. Instead, history changed within moments. Philip entered the theater during celebrations marking the marriage of his daughter Cleopatra. Ancient writers describe an atmosphere of confidence and triumph. Nobles, diplomats, soldiers, and foreign guests filled the gathering. In a deliberate display of authority, Philip reportedly walked without his bodyguards, eager to demonstrate both his popularity and his fearlessness before the assembled crowd. Then a single figure rushed forward. The assassin was Pausanias, a member of Philip's own royal bodyguard. Before anyone could react, he drove a dagger into the king, killing him almost instantly. Pausanias attempted to flee but stumbled while escaping, and was overtaken by pursuing guards, who killed him before any public interrogation could reveal his motives. With the assassin dead, the greatest question remained unanswered. Why did he do it? The earliest surviving accounts point toward personal revenge. According to several ancient historians, Pausanias had suffered a profound humiliation involving powerful members of the Macedonian court. After seeking justice from Philip, he allegedly found little satisfaction. Resentment may have grown until it erupted in violence. For many scholars, this remains the simplest explanation. History contains countless examples where deeply personal grievances have produced consequences far beyond anyone's expectations. Yet, simplicity has rarely satisfied those studying Philip's death. Almost immediately, suspicions expanded beyond the lone assassin. Some wondered whether Pausanias acted entirely on his own or merely served as the final instrument in a much larger conspiracy. The circumstances invited speculation. Philip had accumulated numerous enemies during decades of warfare and political maneuvering. Rival Greek states despised his growing dominance. Persian interests had every reason to fear his planned invasion. Even within his own court, tensions had reached dangerous levels. Attention soon turned toward the royal family itself. Only months before his death, Philip had married another woman named Cleopatra, a Macedonian noblewoman unrelated to his daughter of the same name. The marriage complicated the royal succession. Until then, Alexander had stood as the obvious heir. But if Philip's new wife produced a son considered fully Macedonian by birth, political loyalties could shift dramatically. Ancient sources describe growing conflict within the royal household. At one banquet, an argument reportedly erupted between Philip and Alexander, exposing divisions before the assembled court. Alexander and his mother Olympias temporarily left Macedonia after relations deteriorated. Although father and son later appeared to reconcile, later generations questioned whether the wounds had ever fully healed. Olympias soon became one of the central figures in later conspiracy theories. Several ancient writers claimed she displayed unusual satisfaction after Philip's assassination. Some even alleged that she honored Pausanias after his death or encouraged the elimination of political rivals connected to Philip's final marriage. These stories have fueled centuries of speculation that she may have known more than official accounts revealed. Yet, nearly all such accusations come from sources written long after the events, often colored by political hostility and dramatic storytelling. Alexander himself has also been drawn into these suspicions, although direct evidence remains absent. His rapid accession to the throne undeniably benefited from Philip's death. Within days, he secured royal authority and soon embarked upon the extraordinary conquests his father had only begun to imagine. Whether that sequence reflects careful planning, fortunate circumstance, or simple coincidence remains impossible to determine. Modern historians continue to weigh every possibility: a personal act of vengeance, a court conspiracy, foreign involvement, a combination of several motives unfolding at once. Each theory explains certain details while leaving others unresolved. The theater at Aegi still stands where Philip drew his final breath, but its silent stones reveal nothing about the hidden intentions carried into that gathering so long ago. One carefully aimed blade altered the future of kingdoms, opened the path for Alexander's rise, and created a mystery that has never entirely surrendered its secrets. Somewhere between recorded history, political ambition, and human emotion, the true architect of Philip's death may still remain concealed. If the murder of Philip II altered the destiny of Macedonia in a single violent moment, another royal mystery unfolded decades earlier on the sands of Egypt and the vast frontiers of the Persian Empire. Once again, a powerful king disappeared from the center of history under circumstances that remain frustratingly uncertain. The desert wind moves silently across the ancient road leading toward Memphis, lifting fine grains of sand over weathered stone and broken statues worn smooth by centuries of sunlight. Scattered among the ruins stand the remains of temples that witnessed the arrival of one of antiquity's most formidable conquerors. Here, in 525 BC, Cambyses II, king of Persia and son of Cyrus the Great, completed a campaign that forever changed the balance of power in the ancient Near East. His victory over Egypt was decisive. After defeating Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium, Cambyses entered Egypt as its new ruler. Persian authority now stretched farther than ever before, uniting an empire that reached from Central Asia to the Nile. Contemporary Egyptian documents confirm his reign, and while later traditions often portrayed him as a ruthless conqueror, modern historians suggest the picture was likely far more complicated. Administrative records indicate that he adopted many traditional royal practices and attempted to govern rather than simply occupy his newly conquered territory. Yet, it is what happened afterward that transforms his story into one of history's enduring mysteries. The Greek historian Herodotus recounts several dramatic episodes from Cambyses' Egyptian campaign. Among the most famous is the tale of a massive Persian army sent westward toward the Siwa oasis to punish the priests of the Oracle of Amun. According to the account, 50,000 soldiers marched into the desert, only to disappear beneath an immense sandstorm. No survivors returned, no battlefield was found. The army simply ceased to exist. Whether this expedition truly occurred exactly as described remains uncertain. Archaeologists continue to debate the story, and while scattered discoveries in Egypt's western desert have occasionally sparked excitement, no conclusive evidence has confirmed the fate of such a force. Nevertheless, the legend has become inseparable from Cambyses' reign, adding an atmosphere of mystery to his final years. Soon afterward, troubling news arrived from the heart of the empire. While Cambyses remained in Egypt, reports reached him that a man claiming to be his brother Bardia had seized the Persian throne. According to official Persian inscriptions, the true Bardia had secretly been killed years earlier by Cambyses himself, and the new ruler was an impostor named Gaumata. Herodotus presents a similar story, though with significant differences in detail. Other ancient traditions tell the events differently still, leaving historians to untangle competing versions written by authors with varying loyalties and political motivations. Whatever the truth, Cambyses immediately began the journey back toward Persia. He never completed it. The circumstances of his death remain one of the greatest uncertainties surrounding the early Persian Empire. Herodotus famously describes an accidental wound. As Cambyses mounted his horse, the protective cover of his sword allegedly slipped away, and the exposed blade pierced his thigh. The injury became infected, and after several days of suffering, the king died far from the capital. It is a dramatic story, but not everyone has accepted it. Some historians suspect the account may have been shaped to emphasize divine punishment, reflecting Greek moral storytelling rather than precise historical reporting. Others question whether a seasoned military commander could truly have suffered such an unlikely accident. Was the wound genuine, or did it conceal something else? Alternative theories have accumulated over the centuries. Perhaps Cambyses died from illness after years of exhausting campaigns across difficult climates. Others have suggested assassination, arguing that powerful figures seeking control of the empire may have removed him before he could challenge the new claimant to the throne. A few researchers even wonder whether later rulers deliberately reshaped the official narrative to strengthen their own legitimacy, leaving inconvenient facts to disappear from the historical record. One of the most important sources, the Behistun inscription commissioned by Darius I, describes Cambyses' death only briefly, while presenting Darius's own rise to power as the restoration of lawful rule. Because Darius benefited directly from these events, historians carefully examine the inscription, recognizing both its immense historical value and its political purpose. Every surviving source carries similar challenges, forcing scholars to compare fragments rather than rely upon any single account. Cambyses entered Egypt as the ruler of the world's greatest empire, yet his own final journey remains clouded by uncertainty. Did an accident end the life of Persia's king? Did conspirators remove him before he could reclaim his throne? Or did later generations reshape his story until fact and legend became impossible to separate? Somewhere between desert roads, royal inscriptions, and conflicting chronicles, the true fate of Cambyses II still waits beyond the reach of complete certainty. If the death of Cambyses II left the Persian Empire without its ruler, an even deeper mystery emerged in the confusion that followed. A new king suddenly appeared, claiming a royal identity that perhaps belonged to him, or perhaps never did. From that moment onward, history divided into competing versions of the same remarkable story. High above the plains of western Persia, an immense limestone cliff rises from the landscape. Carved into its face is one of the ancient world's greatest historical inscriptions. Figures of kings and prisoners stand frozen in stone, while hundreds of lines of cuneiform proclaim the triumph of a new ruler. For more than 2,000 years, the Behistun inscription has overlooked passing travelers, preserving a single official account of one of Persia's greatest political mysteries. At the center of that account stands a man known to history as Gaumata. According to King Darius I, who ordered the inscription, the real Bardia, known to Greek writers as Smerdis, had been secretly killed by his own brother, Cambyses II, long before news reached the empire. Because the murder remained hidden, few people supposedly knew the prince was already dead. During Cambyses' absence in Egypt, a Magian priest named Gaumata allegedly seized the opportunity, claiming to be the missing royal heir. The empire accepted him, believing the legitimate son of Cyrus the Great had returned. If Darius's version is correct, the deception was astonishing. Gaumata successfully convinced nobles, provincial governors, soldiers, and ordinary subjects that he was Bardia. He ruled the empire for several months before Darius and 6 noble companions organized a daring conspiracy, entered the royal fortress, and killed the impostor. Darius then declared himself the lawful king, presenting the assassination as the rescue of Persia from fraud and rebellion. For centuries, this explanation shaped the accepted historical narrative. Yet, almost every surviving source ultimately traces back to Darius himself. The Behistun inscription was not a neutral chronicle. It was a royal proclamation commissioned by the very man who benefited most from Gaumata's death. Darius belonged to a different branch of the royal family and did not inherit the throne directly from Cyrus the Great. His claim depended heavily upon proving that the previous ruler had never been legitimate. That fact has led many historians to ask an uncomfortable question. What if the man Darius killed really was Bardia? Some modern scholars have suggested that the official version may have served as political propaganda. If Bardia had genuinely survived Cambyses, Darius's seizure of power could appear less like the restoration of lawful order and more like a carefully organized coup. Declaring the dead king an impostor would immediately justify the transfer of power while discouraging opposition throughout the empire. Unfortunately, confirming either possibility is extraordinarily difficult. Greek historians such as Herodotus preserved dramatic versions of the story, adding details absent from Persian inscriptions. In one famous account, members of the royal household tested the supposed king by asking whether he possessed ears. According to Herodotus, Gaumata had previously lost them as punishment for another offense, exposing his deception. It is an unforgettable tale, but many historians view it cautiously, recognizing the Greek author's preference for memorable storytelling alongside historical reporting. Administrative records from the period offer only limited assistance. Some tablets simply recognize the reigning king without questioning his identity. Others reveal the remarkable speed with which authority shifted across the empire. They illuminate daily government but remain largely silent on the central mystery: who actually occupied the throne? The debate grows even more intriguing when considering the public response. Ancient sources suggest many provinces accepted Gaumata with surprisingly little resistance. Some accounts even describe tax reductions and temporary relief from military service during his brief reign. If these reports contain truth, they raise another possibility. Was Gaumata accepted merely because people believed he was Bardia, or because his rule genuinely appealed to large portions of the empire regardless of his identity? Speculative theories have emerged over the centuries. Some imagine that Gaumata and Bardia worked together before events spiraled beyond control. Others propose that competing court factions deliberately blurred the truth until no one could distinguish prince from pretender. While such ideas remain unsupported by direct evidence, they reflect the extraordinary gaps left by incomplete historical records. Today, the towering inscription at Behistun still declares Darius's victory with unwavering confidence. Yet, stone preserves only one voice among many that have long since fallen silent. Somewhere between royal propaganda, fragmented chronicles, and vanished witnesses lies the true identity of the man history remembers as the false Smerdis, a mystery that continues to challenge every attempt to separate power from truth. If the identity of a Persian king could become obscured by politics and conflicting testimony, the fate of Persia's greatest ceremonial capital presents another puzzle entirely. This time, the mystery is not about who ruled, but why one of the ancient world's most magnificent cities was deliberately consumed by fire. At the foot of the Zagros Mountains, immense stone staircases climb toward towering columns that still reach into the open sky. Carved reliefs line the walls with astonishing precision, showing delegates from distant nations carrying gifts to the Persian king. Every figure is carefully sculpted. Every robe, beard, and ornament reflects the extraordinary craftsmanship of an empire at its height. Although the roofs disappeared long ago, Persepolis still radiates quiet grandeur, as though waiting for visitors who never returned. When Alexander the Great entered Persepolis in 330 BC, he stood inside one of the wealthiest royal centers in the ancient world. Built by Darius I and expanded by his successors, the city was less an ordinary capital than a monumental stage for imperial ceremony. Here, representatives from across the Persian Empire gathered during great festivals, affirming loyalty to a dynasty that ruled millions of people across 3 continents. The city surrendered after Alexander's victories farther west. Its vast treasuries fell into Macedonian hands, providing immense wealth that financed future campaigns. Ancient writers describe enormous quantities of gold, silver, and precious objects carried away over many months. Yet, despite securing both the city and its riches, Alexander soon ordered, or at least permitted, an act that has puzzled historians ever since. The royal palaces were set ablaze. Even today, archaeological evidence preserves traces of intense fire. Blackened stone, damaged columns, and burned structural remains confirm that large portions of the palace complex experienced a destructive blaze. The fire was real. Its cause, however, remains one of antiquity's most enduring mysteries. Ancient historians offer dramatically different explanations. Perhaps the most famous account comes from Plutarch and Diodorus Siculus. According to their narratives, Alexander attended a lavish banquet after capturing the city. As wine flowed and celebration grew increasingly reckless, an Athenian woman named Thais reportedly urged him to burn the Persian palace in symbolic revenge for the destruction of Athens by the Persian king Xerxes more than a century earlier. Inspired by emotion, Alexander allegedly seized a torch and led the procession that ignited the buildings. It is an unforgettable story, yet many historians question whether events unfolded so simply. Alexander was not merely a victorious general. He was rapidly transforming himself into ruler of the former Persian Empire. He had already adopted certain Persian customs and increasingly relied upon Persian officials within his administration. Deliberately destroying the symbolic heart of the empire he intended to govern seems, at first glance, politically self-defeating. This contradiction has encouraged alternative interpretations. Some researchers believe the fire represented a calculated political message rather than an impulsive celebration. Burning Persepolis may have demonstrated to both Macedonian soldiers and Persian subjects that the old Achaemenid dynasty had truly ended. By destroying its ceremonial center, Alexander could announce that a new era had begun under his authority. Others suggest the opposite. Ancient sources preserve hints that Alexander later regretted the destruction. Several writers claim he realized too late that the palace represented not merely the residence of defeated enemies, but one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. If true, the fire may have reflected a rare moment in which emotion temporarily overcame the careful judgment that had guided much of his remarkable career. Archaeology adds another layer to the mystery. Excavations indicate that not every structure at Persepolis burned equally. Certain buildings suffered catastrophic destruction, while others escaped comparatively limited damage. This uneven pattern has led some scholars to wonder whether the fire was more controlled than ancient writers implied. Was it targeted toward specific royal buildings? Did changing winds shape the destruction? Or did later generations simplify a far more complicated sequence of events? Speculative theories occasionally venture even further. Some have proposed accidental ignition during celebrations that quickly spread beyond control. Others imagine rival factions within Alexander's army encouraging the destruction to discourage reconciliation with Persian elites. Although direct evidence for these ideas remains limited, they illustrate how many possibilities survive when historical records refuse to agree. Today, Persepolis endures as both a masterpiece of ancient architecture and a monument to unanswered questions. Its carved stairways continue to welcome silent processions of stone ambassadors whose empire disappeared long ago. The flames that once illuminated its palaces have long since faded, but the reason they were lit remains remarkably elusive. Was the burning an act of revenge, political strategy, drunken impulse, calculated symbolism, or something more complex than any surviving source can fully explain? The ruins offer no reply, preserving their silence as faithfully as they preserve their scars. If the flames of Persepolis continue to conceal the motives behind one of history's most controversial acts, another mystery from the same era unfolds hundreds of miles to the west. This time, the question is not why a city burned, but how a seemingly unbeatable defensive position suddenly became a fatal trap. Morning mist drifts between steep limestone cliffs and the restless waters of the Malian Gulf. Today, the coastline has shifted, and centuries of sediment have widened the landscape. But in 480 BC, the pass at Thermopylae was astonishingly narrow. In places, only a small force could stand shoulder to shoulder, turning the natural terrain into a formidable barrier. Here, where mountains pressed against the sea, King Leonidas of Sparta made his final stand against the vast army of the Persian king Xerxes. For 3 days, the pass held. Ancient sources describe repeated Persian assaults breaking against the disciplined Greek defenders. The narrow ground denied Xerxes the advantage of overwhelming numbers. Spartan hoplites, supported by warriors from several other Greek cities, fought with remarkable coordination, forcing wave after wave of attackers into a confined battlefield where courage and discipline outweighed numerical superiority. Yet, the defense did not fail from the front. It collapsed from behind. The earliest and most influential account comes from Herodotus, writing several decades after the battle. According to his narrative, a local man named Ephialtes approached Xerxes with crucial information. He revealed the existence of a mountain path known as the Anapeia Trail, a route that bypassed the narrow pass and allowed Persian forces to encircle the Greek defenders. Guided through the darkness, a selected Persian contingent crossed the mountains during the night, emerging behind Leonidas' position by dawn. The story has endured for centuries. In many languages, the name Ephialtes became synonymous with treachery itself. But how much do we truly know about the man? Surprisingly little. Herodotus identifies Ephialtes as a resident of the region and even records his father's name. He also claims the traitor later fled after a reward was offered for his capture, only to be killed years afterward under unrelated circumstances. Beyond those details, the historical record grows remarkably thin. No writings survive from Ephialtes himself. No contemporary Persian account confirms his role. Almost everything known about the alleged betrayal ultimately traces back to Greek tradition. That has encouraged historians to ask a careful question. Did one individual truly determine the outcome of Thermopylae? Some researchers argue that the mountain path was unlikely to have been a complete secret. Local shepherds, hunters, traders, and regional communities had probably known the route for generations. Persian scouts may eventually have discovered it independently, especially while operating in territory occupied for several days. If so, Ephialtes may have accelerated an inevitable discovery rather than fundamentally changing the battle. Others suggest the situation was even more complex. Herodotus himself briefly mentions alternative names proposed by some contemporaries as possible informants. Although he ultimately rejects these claims, their existence reveals that disagreement over the identity of the betrayer emerged almost immediately. Even among ancient Greeks, certainty proved elusive. Military historians also note that Leonidas was not entirely unaware of the mountain trail. Ancient sources indicate that a force of Phocian soldiers had been assigned specifically to guard it. During the Persian advance, however, they were reportedly surprised and forced to withdraw to higher ground, allowing Xerxes' troops to continue their march. Was this simply the result of superior Persian tactics, or did failures in communication, planning, or coordination contribute just as much as any act of betrayal? Speculation extends beyond the battlefield itself. Some later traditions portray Ephialtes as driven by greed, expecting generous rewards from Xerxes. Others imagine resentment toward neighboring communities or political grievances lost to history. Because direct evidence is absent, These motives remain possibilities rather than established facts. Human ambition, fear, survival, and opportunity often intertwine in ways that leave few traces for future generations. More speculative theories occasionally question whether Ephialtes has become a symbolic figure, representing collective failures rather than the actions of one man. In this view, later storytellers may have concentrated responsibility into a single, recognizable villain, making an immensely complicated military defeat easier to understand and remember. While no evidence confirms this interpretation, it highlights how historical memory often favors clear narratives over uncertain realities. Today, the landscape of Thermopylae has changed dramatically, shaped by rivers, earthquakes, and centuries of natural transformation. The narrow gateway that once defined the battle has largely disappeared beneath accumulated earth. Yet, the mystery remains remarkably familiar. Did one local guide alter the course of history with a single decision? Or has the legend of betrayal gradually overshadowed a far more complicated chain of events? Somewhere between Herodotus's enduring account, the silent mountain path, and the vanished footprints of countless soldiers, the full truth of Thermopylae may still lie hidden beyond history's reach. If the identity of the man known as the false Smerdis remains uncertain, then another mystery follows almost naturally. For if one king's claim to the throne is questioned, what should we make of the man who replaced him? Was Darius the first truly Persia's rightful savior, or the architect of one of antiquity's most successful political transformations? High above an ancient trade route, the towering cliff of Behistun dominates the surrounding landscape. Its sheer limestone face rises like a natural fortress, visible for miles across the plain. Carved into its surface are the images of a victorious king standing over defeated enemies, accompanied by hundreds of lines of carefully inscribed cuneiform. The monument was designed to endure for eternity, proclaiming a single version of events to everyone who passed below. Yet, even monuments carved in stone cannot silence every question. When Cambyses II died in 522 BC, the Persian Empire entered one of the most uncertain moments in its history. According to Darius's own inscription, the throne had been seized by an impostor named Gaumata, who falsely claimed to be Bardia, the son of Cyrus the Great. Darius declared that he and 6 noble companions secretly entered the royal stronghold, killed the pretender, and restored legitimate rule to the empire. It is a compelling story. It is also the foundation upon which Darius built his authority. Unlike Cyrus the Great and Cambyses II, Darius did not descend directly from the main royal line. He belonged to another branch of the Achaemenid family, making his claim more distant than that of Cyrus's immediate descendants. This fact alone meant that convincing the empire of his legitimacy became one of his greatest political challenges. The Behistun inscription addressed that challenge directly. Throughout its carefully composed narrative, Darius repeatedly emphasizes divine approval. He credits the supreme deity Ahura Mazda with granting him victory and restoring order after a period of deception and rebellion. Again and again, the inscription presents Darius not as an ambitious noble seeking power, but as the chosen defender of truth against falsehood. Many historians accept that Darius genuinely believed he had rescued the empire from instability. Under his rule, Persia became one of history's greatest imperial powers. He reorganized administration, improved roads, standardized taxation, expanded monumental architecture, and strengthened communication across an enormous territory. His achievements are well documented and continue to shape our understanding of ancient governance. Yet, remarkable accomplishments do not necessarily answer questions about the path that brought him to the throne. Modern scholars continue to examine the earliest months of Darius's reign with unusual care. Almost immediately after taking power, he faced widespread revolts across multiple provinces. Official inscriptions portray these uprisings as rebellions by liars falsely claiming royal identities. Another interpretation, however, suggests that many regions may have resisted because they questioned Darius's legitimacy from the very beginning. The possibility cannot be dismissed easily. If the man Darius identified as Gaumata had actually been the genuine Bardia, then the political landscape changes dramatically. Under that scenario, Darius would no longer appear as the empire's liberator, but as the leader of a successful coup against the lawful king. Although no surviving evidence conclusively proves this interpretation, the absence of independent contemporary accounts leaves room for continued debate. Even the famous conspiracy itself raises difficult questions. According to tradition, 7 Persian nobles risked everything by entering the royal palace together to eliminate the alleged impostor. Ancient Greek writers preserve dramatic versions of this episode, including discussions about the future of government after the assassination. Some details differ considerably from the Persian inscriptions, while others seem shaped by literary traditions rather than eyewitness testimony. Were these conversations remembered accurately, embellished over time, or partly invented to emphasize noble ideals? The surviving sources cannot fully resolve the issue. There are also quieter mysteries hidden within the official record. How did Darius organize support so quickly across such a vast empire? How much planning occurred before Gaumata's death? Did influential aristocratic families already favor replacing the existing ruler? Or did events unfold with extraordinary speed after an unexpected opportunity emerged? The answers remain concealed behind the limited evidence that has survived. Today, the inscriptions at Behistun continue to proclaim Darius's triumph with unwavering confidence, their words preserved in stone, while countless other voices have disappeared forever. The empire he shaped became one of antiquity's greatest civilizations, but the precise story of how he first secured its throne remains suspended between history and political memory. Somewhere beneath the certainty of royal proclamations and the silence of missing records may lie a more complicated truth, one that the passing centuries have carefully hidden from view. If Darius I's rise reminds us that the greatest victories are often won as much through politics as through battle, another mystery from the ancient world asks a different question altogether. Sometimes history is shaped not by the decision a commander makes, but by the one he never does. The plains of southern Italy stretch quietly beneath the afternoon sun. Wheat fields ripple where thousands of soldiers once stood shoulder to shoulder, their armor flashing beneath clouds of dust. Little remains to mark the exact ground where one of history's most devastating battles unfolded. Yet the silence of Cannae still carries an unsettling question, one that has echoed for more than 2,000 years. Why did Hannibal stop? In the summer of 216 BC, Hannibal Barca achieved what many military historians still regard as one of the greatest tactical victories ever recorded. Facing a Roman army that vastly outnumbered his own, the Carthaginian commander executed a brilliant double envelopment maneuver, surrounding and destroying much of Rome's military force. Ancient sources describe the battlefield as a scene of extraordinary devastation. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were killed within a single day, including senators, magistrates, and experienced officers whose loss shook the Republic to its foundations. For many observers, the road to Rome appeared open. Ancient tradition preserves a famous remark attributed to Hannibal's cavalry commander, Maharbal. Seeing the defeated Romans fleeing in every direction, he is said to have urged an immediate advance on the capital. According to the Roman historian Livy, Maharbal declared that within 5 days, Hannibal could dine victorious on the Capitoline Hill. Hannibal refused. Whether those exact words were ever spoken remains uncertain, but the conversation has become one of history's most enduring moments of military debate. At first glance, the decision seems almost impossible to understand. How could a commander who had crossed the Alps with elephants, defeated Roman armies repeatedly, and shattered the Republic's greatest field force choose not to strike the enemy's heart when victory seemed within reach? Modern historians offer several practical explanations. Although triumphant, Hannibal's army had endured years of continuous campaigning far from home. His soldiers were exhausted. Many had suffered wounds during the battle itself. More importantly, Hannibal lacked the heavy siege equipment necessary to assault a city protected by massive walls. Rome was not merely another battlefield. It was one of the strongest fortified cities in the Mediterranean, defended by remaining troops, armed citizens, and reserves that could still be mobilized despite the catastrophe at Cannae. Logistics may have mattered even more. Hannibal remained deep inside hostile territory. His supply lines stretched across enormous distances, while Roman forces continued to control the sea, limiting Carthage's ability to reinforce or resupply his campaign. Capturing Rome would likely require a prolonged siege, yet maintaining such an operation without secure logistical support posed extraordinary challenges. There was also a broader strategy. Many scholars believe Hannibal never intended to destroy Rome through direct assault. Instead, he may have hoped repeated victories would persuade Rome's Italian allies to abandon the Republic, gradually isolating the city until it could no longer sustain the war. In the months following Cannae, several important communities did indeed change allegiance. However, many of Rome's most loyal allies remained committed despite the disaster, frustrating Hannibal's expectations. Still, questions remain. Could boldness alone have altered history? Some historians argue that Rome was psychologically vulnerable after Cannae in ways impossible to measure today. Fear, confusion, and political uncertainty filled the city. Would an immediate appearance outside its gates have triggered panic, surrender, or internal collapse? Or would the Romans, known for extraordinary resilience, have resisted with even greater determination? Ancient writers themselves disagreed. Polybius generally emphasized practical military realities, portraying Hannibal as a careful strategist rather than a hesitant commander. Livy, writing from a Roman perspective generations later, preserved dramatic conversations highlighting the consequences of lost opportunity. Each account reflects not only historical evidence, but also the values and assumptions of its author. More speculative interpretations occasionally emerge as well. Some suggest Hannibal possessed intelligence indicating Rome remained stronger than appearances suggested. Others wonder whether political divisions within Carthage limited his freedom to pursue riskier operations, leaving him without the reinforcements needed for a decisive siege. While surviving evidence offers no firm confirmation, these possibilities remind us how many decisions were influenced by information now permanently lost. Today, the fields of Cannae reveal little of the moment when the Roman Republic came closest to destruction. Yet the mystery endures. Did Hannibal miss history's greatest opportunity, or did he wisely avoid a campaign that was never truly possible? Somewhere between ancient chronicles, military calculation, and the unknowable pressures facing a commander far from home lies an answer that may forever remain beyond complete certainty. If Hannibal's greatest mystery lies in a battle that never happened, another enigmatic story asks how one of the ancient world's most celebrated strategists met his end, not on a battlefield, but far from the homeland he once saved. The quiet waters of the Meander River wind slowly through the fertile valleys of western Asia Minor, reflecting groves of cypress and olive beneath a pale sky. Near its banks stood the city of Magnesia, a prosperous settlement within the Persian Empire. To most travelers, it was simply another distant provincial city. But for one aging statesman, it became the final refuge of a man whose decisions had once determined the fate of Greece. His name was Themistocles. Few figures in ancient history experienced such extraordinary reversals of fortune. During the Persian Wars, Themistocles emerged as the architect of Athens' naval power. He understood that control of the sea would decide the conflict, and he persuaded his fellow citizens to invest in a powerful fleet rather than immediate military rewards. That decision culminated in the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, where the Greek fleet achieved a victory that altered the course of history. Yet triumph proved temporary. Political rivalries in Athens eventually overwhelmed even his remarkable reputation. Like many influential leaders of the period, Themistocles became the target of suspicion, jealousy, and shifting alliances. He was ostracized, forced into exile, and wandered across the Greek world before seeking protection from an unlikely source, the Persian Empire, the very power he had once helped defeat. The irony was profound. According to ancient writers, the Persian king welcomed him with honor, granting him estates and authority over several cities. The former defender of Greece spent his final years serving the empire that had once regarded him as its greatest enemy. It was a transformation so extraordinary that later generations struggled to understand it. Then, as suddenly as his political fortunes had changed, the historical record grows uncertain. The exact circumstances of Themistocles' death remain one of antiquity's quieter mysteries. The earliest and most respected account comes from the historian Thucydides, who wrote that Themistocles died of natural causes while living in Magnesia. His narrative is restrained and cautious, avoiding dramatic embellishment. For many historians, this remains the most reliable explanation, partly because Thucydides lived closer to the events than most later writers and was known for his careful approach to historical evidence. But later traditions tell a different story. According to several ancient authors, the Persian king eventually demanded that Themistocles lead a military campaign against Greece. Faced with the impossible choice between loyalty to the ruler who had sheltered him and loyalty to the homeland he had once defended, Themistocles supposedly chose a third path. Rather than raise arms against Greece, he ended his own life. The manner of that death varies from one account to another. Some traditions claim he drank poison. Others describe him consuming the blood of a sacrificial bull, believing it to be fatal. A few versions leave the method deliberately vague, emphasizing only that he willingly accepted death rather than betray his earlier achievements. These stories transformed Themistocles into a tragic figure whose final act restored the honor that exile had threatened to erase. Yet, historians approach these accounts with caution. Ancient biographies often sought moral lessons as much as historical accuracy. A voluntary death in defense of personal principle created a compelling conclusion to an extraordinary life. Such narratives appealed to later audiences, especially within Greek literary traditions that celebrated sacrifice, honor, and difficult choices. Whether they reflected actual events remains far less certain. Political motives may also have shaped the surviving stories. For Athenians, portraying Themistocles as someone who ultimately refused to fight against Greece softened the uncomfortable reality that one of their greatest heroes had accepted service under Persian rule. For Persian traditions, emphasizing his loyalty and distinguished service reinforced the prestige of the empire itself. Between these competing perspectives, historical certainty becomes increasingly difficult to recover. Another mystery surrounds his burial. Some ancient sources suggest his remains were secretly returned to Attica despite official prohibitions against his return. Others insist he remained buried in Magnesia, where later generations reportedly pointed to his tomb. Archaeological evidence has never conclusively resolved the question, leaving even his final resting place uncertain. Themistocles spent his life navigating impossible decisions, balancing ambition, survival, patriotism, and political reality in ways few leaders have ever faced. Perhaps it is fitting that the closing chapter of his story remains just as elusive. Did age quietly claim him in peaceful exile, or did he consciously choose death rather than confront an unbearable dilemma? Somewhere between sober history and enduring legend, the final moments of the man who reshaped the ancient world continue to drift through time, as difficult to grasp as the slow-moving waters beside his last known home. If the final days of Themistocles remain suspended between history and legend, another mystery invites us into the inner circle of Alexander the Great, where loyalty, ambition, and suspicion became nearly impossible to separate. This time, the unanswered question concerns not how a man died, but who truly decided that he should. The cold mountain air moves quietly through the ruins of an ancient fortress in Central Asia. Broken walls overlook narrow valleys where caravans once crossed the eastern frontier of Alexander's expanding empire. Far from the familiar cities of Greece, the conqueror's court had become a moving capital, carrying philosophers, historians, generals, and advisors across lands few Macedonians had ever imagined. Yet, within this remarkable gathering, trust was beginning to fracture. Among those traveling with Alexander was Callisthenes of Olynthus. A respected historian and the grandnephew of the philosopher Aristotle, Callisthenes had accompanied the expedition to record its achievements for future generations. His writings celebrated Alexander's victories and presented the campaign as an extraordinary chapter in Greek history. For a time, he stood close to the king, enjoying a position of considerable influence within the royal court. Gradually, however, that relationship began to change. As Alexander pushed deeper into the former Persian Empire, he increasingly adopted elements of Persian royal ceremony. Among the most controversial was the practice known as proskynesis, a gesture of deep respect performed before the great king. While common in Persian tradition, many Macedonians viewed such behavior as appropriate only toward the gods. To bow before a mortal ruler challenged deeply rooted Greek customs and ideas about kingship. According to several ancient accounts, Callisthenes openly opposed the practice. Writers such as Arrian and Plutarch describe a famous occasion during which he refused to perform the ceremonial gesture and delivered a speech defending traditional Greek values. Whether every word attributed to him is authentic remains uncertain, but the broader conflict appears well established. His refusal embarrassed Alexander publicly and highlighted growing tensions within the royal court over the king's evolving identity. Soon afterward, another crisis unfolded. In 327 BC, a group of young royal pages was accused of plotting to assassinate Alexander. Known today as the Pages' Conspiracy, the alleged plot involved several aristocratic youths serving within the king's household. Ancient sources agree that the conspirators were arrested and executed after interrogation. What happened next remains far less clear. Callisthenes himself was accused of encouraging the conspiracy or influencing the young men through his criticism of Alexander's policies. Yet the surviving evidence is remarkably thin. No direct proof links him to the assassination attempt. Instead, much of the case appears to rest upon association, suspicion, and the increasingly strained relationship between the historian and the king. Even the manner of his death is uncertain. Some ancient writers claim Callisthenes was imprisoned, tortured, and eventually executed by Alexander's order. Others suggest he died from illness while awaiting trial. A few accounts imply that no formal execution ever occurred, leaving his death the result of harsh imprisonment rather than an explicit royal command. These conflicting narratives reveal just how quickly certainty dissolves when the available sources disagree. An equally important question concerns Alexander himself. Did the king personally order Callisthenes' death, or did influential advisors act on their own initiative while knowing what outcome Alexander desired? Royal courts often operated through powerful generals, secretaries, and officials who interpreted the ruler's wishes without requiring direct commands. If Callisthenes had become politically inconvenient, eliminating him may have required little more than an atmosphere in which accusations could flourish. Some historians view the episode as part of a broader transformation within Alexander's reign. Years of continuous warfare, repeated conspiracies, and the immense pressures of ruling a vast empire may have made the king increasingly suspicious of criticism. Others argue that later Greek writers, uncomfortable with Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, portrayed Callisthenes as a principled victim resisting tyranny, shaping the narrative to emphasize moral conflict rather than political complexity. More speculative interpretations go even further. Some suggest the conspiracy itself may have been exaggerated to justify removing a troublesome intellectual whose influence threatened factions within the court. Others wonder whether rival officials manipulated events, using Callisthenes as a convenient target while concealing their own ambitions. No surviving evidence confirms these possibilities, yet neither can they be entirely dismissed given the fragmentary nature of the historical record. Today, the voice of Callisthenes survives only in scattered quotations preserved by later authors. His own history of Alexander's campaign has largely disappeared, leaving others to tell the story of his final days. Whether he fell because he challenged a king, became entangled in genuine conspiracy, or simply stood too close to dangerous politics remains unresolved. Somewhere between loyalty and dissent, truth and accusation, the fate of Alexander's historian continues to wait in silence, hidden behind the missing pages of history itself. If the fate of Callisthenes reminds us how dangerous ideas could become in the courts of kings, another mystery leads us to the streets of Athens, where words alone were powerful enough to place a philosopher on trial. More than 2,000 years later, one question continues to linger. Was Socrates condemned for what he believed, or for the political fears surrounding him? The first light of morning spreads across the worn stones of the Athenian agora. Merchants prepare their stalls as footsteps echo beneath shaded colonnades. Citizens gather in small circles, debating laws, trade, and the future of their city. It was here, among these crowded walkways, that an elderly man spent countless hours asking simple questions that often produced deeply uncomfortable answers. His name was Socrates. Unlike many famous thinkers of the ancient world, Socrates left behind no writings of his own. Everything known about his ideas comes through the works of others, most notably Plato, Xenophon, and the playwright Aristophanes. Each portrayed him differently, preserving not a single clear image, but several overlapping portraits of a man whose conversations challenged assumptions about justice, virtue, knowledge, and power. By 399 BC, Athens was a city still recovering from profound trauma. The long Peloponnesian War had ended in defeat. The brief but brutal rule of the 30 tyrants had shaken confidence in democracy, leaving political divisions that remained painfully fresh. Suspicion lingered throughout the city. Citizens who had once trusted neighbors now viewed one another more cautiously, aware that recent history had demonstrated how quickly governments could collapse. It was during this fragile period that Socrates was brought before an Athenian jury. The official charges appear straightforward. He was accused of failing to acknowledge the city's traditional gods, introducing new spiritual beliefs, and corrupting the youth of Athens. According to Plato's Apology, Socrates defended himself not by pleading for mercy, but by continuing the very style of questioning that had made him famous. Rather than abandoning his principles, he challenged the assumptions of his accusers even as they judged his fate. On the surface, the case appears to concern religion and education. Yet many historians believe the deeper issue may have been politics. Several individuals closely associated with Socrates had become controversial figures in Athenian history. Among them was Critias, one of the leaders of the 30 tyrants, whose oppressive rule left lasting scars upon the city. Another was Alcibiades, the brilliant but unpredictable general whose shifting loyalties and political ambitions contributed to Athens' instability during the Peloponnesian War. Although Socrates cannot be held responsible for the later actions of those who knew him, these connections may have shaped public perception in ways difficult to measure today. The timing itself raises important questions. Why was Socrates prosecuted decades after becoming a well-known public figure? His methods had changed little over the years, yet only after Athens emerged from political upheaval did formal charges appear. To some scholars, this suggests that the trial reflected broader anxieties rather than sudden concern over philosophical discussion alone. Others urge caution. The Athenians who voted to convict Socrates lived within a deeply religious society where civic identity, public ritual, and traditional belief were closely connected. Challenging accepted ideas about the gods could be understood not merely as intellectual disagreement, but as a threat to social cohesion itself. In this interpretation, the charges should be taken largely at face value rather than viewed solely through a political lens. Ancient sources themselves complicate the picture. Plato presents Socrates as an unwavering seeker of truth whose commitment to philosophy ultimately cost him his life. Xenophon offers a somewhat different emphasis, portraying his teacher as morally upright and accepting of the legal process. Aristophanes, writing years earlier in the Comedy Clouds, had already depicted Socrates as an eccentric intellectual, capable of undermining traditional values. Although intended as satire, the play may have influenced public opinion long before the trial ever began. More speculative interpretations continue to emerge. Some researchers wonder whether influential political figures quietly encouraged the prosecution, while allowing religious accusations to serve as a more acceptable public justification. Others suggest the trial became a symbolic act through which Athens sought to distance itself from recent instability by condemning a figure associated, however indirectly, with controversial personalities. These possibilities remain difficult to prove, yet they illustrate how closely philosophy and politics often intertwined in the ancient world. After the verdict, Socrates calmly accepted the sentence of death, drinking a cup of poison hemlock surrounded by his students. His composure became one of history's defining images of intellectual conviction. Yet the reasons behind the judgment remain far less certain. Was Athens silencing a dangerous philosopher, protecting its fragile democracy, responding to genuine religious concerns, or expressing fears born from years of conflict and political trauma? Somewhere within the crowded courts of ancient Athens, beneath speeches preserved only in fragments and memories shaped by generations of interpretation, the true motive behind the execution of Socrates may still remain just beyond our reach. If the trial of Socrates reveals how ideas can shape the destiny of a single man, another mystery invites us to consider the ambitions of an empire. This time, the question is not why one philosopher was condemned, but what truly drove one of history's greatest kings to launch an invasion that would forever change the ancient world. The waters of the Hellespont shimmer beneath a gray morning sky, where Europe and Asia nearly touch. Strong currents race between the two shores, carrying echoes of countless ships that once crossed these narrow straits. Along this passage, the Persian king Xerxes ordered 2 immense pontoon bridges to be constructed, linking continents with timber, rope, and engineering on a scale few had ever witnessed. It was more than a military crossing. It was a declaration that an empire intended to move where nature itself had drawn a boundary. In 480 BC, Xerxes led one of the largest military expeditions of the ancient world toward Greece. Ancient writers describe vast armies and fleets gathered from every corner of the Persian Empire, bringing together peoples speaking different languages, wearing different armor, and following different customs beneath the authority of a single ruler. Whether the numbers recorded by Greek historians are exaggerated remains widely debated, but there is little doubt that the campaign represented an extraordinary display of imperial organization. The traditional explanation appears straightforward. A decade earlier, Xerxes' father, Darius I, had failed to subdue the Greek city-states after the Battle of Marathon. The Persian court had never forgotten that defeat. From this perspective, Xerxes' campaign was an act of unfinished business, a determined effort to restore imperial prestige, punish rebellious cities that had supported earlier revolts in Asia Minor, and complete the mission left unfinished by his father. Many historians continue to regard this as the most convincing interpretation. Yet, even this explanation raises further questions. If revenge alone motivated the invasion, why prepare on such an immense scale? Xerxes spent years assembling supplies, constructing canals, organizing transport networks, and coordinating forces from across a vast empire. These preparations suggest objectives extending well beyond symbolic retaliation. Such an investment implies long-term ambitions rather than a single punitive expedition. Economic considerations may have played an equally important role. Control of the Aegean Sea offered access to valuable maritime trade routes linking the eastern Mediterranean with the wider Greek world. Bringing mainland Greece under Persian influence could strengthen commercial networks already stretching from Egypt to Central Asia. Rather than viewing the campaign solely as conquest, some scholars see it as part of a broader strategy to secure stability along the empire's western frontier while expanding its economic reach. Political authority also deserves consideration. The Persian Empire governed an enormous diversity of peoples, languages, and traditions. Demonstrating overwhelming military strength reinforced the image of the great king as an unstoppable ruler whose authority extended across the known world. A successful campaign against Greece would not merely add territory. It would send a powerful message to every province that resistance to Persian rule remained futile. Ancient sources introduce another intriguing element. Herodotus recounts dreams and divine signs that allegedly encouraged Xerxes to proceed despite moments of hesitation. According to his narrative, mysterious visions repeatedly urged the king to continue with the invasion, while advisors debated whether these experiences reflected genuine divine guidance or dangerous ambition. Modern historians generally approach such accounts as literary and cultural expressions rather than literal historical evidence. Yet, they reveal how ancient societies understood decisions of extraordinary consequence. The Persian perspective, unfortunately, remains much quieter. Unlike Greek historians, Persian royal inscriptions say relatively little about the invasion itself. Most surviving Persian records emphasize royal legitimacy, construction projects, and divine favor rather than providing detailed explanations for military campaigns. As a result, much of the story reaches us through Greek authors writing from the perspective of those who resisted Xerxes. Their accounts remain invaluable, but they inevitably reflect the experiences and priorities of one side of the conflict. Speculative interpretations have emerged from this imbalance. Some researchers wonder whether diplomatic solutions were explored more extensively than surviving Greek sources suggest. Others propose that later Greek writers intentionally emphasized themes of freedom versus tyranny, shaping Xerxes into a symbol of imperial ambition while overlooking more practical strategic considerations. These possibilities remain difficult to verify, yet they remind us that history often survives through incomplete voices. Today, the waters of the Hellespont continue their endless movement between two continents, indifferent to the armies that once crossed above them. Xerxes' invasion became one of antiquity's defining events, remembered through battles, legends, and heroic resistance. Yet, beneath those familiar stories lies a quieter mystery. Was the campaign driven by vengeance, imperial necessity, economic ambition, personal glory, or a combination so complex that no surviving source could fully capture it? Somewhere between royal silence and Greek memory, the true motive behind Xerxes' march into Greece may still remain hidden beneath the currents of history. If Xerxes' true intentions remain hidden behind the silence of royal inscriptions, another mystery asks an equally haunting question. Sometimes history is not concealed by secret motives or forgotten battles, but by words that simply disappeared, leaving only scattered echoes of what humanity once knew. Dust drifts through the broken halls of an ancient library where only fragments remain. Shelves that once held countless scrolls now stand empty, their wooden frames long since turned to ash or decay. Sunlight falls across cracked stone floors where generations of scholars may have searched for answers, copied manuscripts, and debated ideas that shaped the ancient world. Somewhere among vanished collections, entire books may have disappeared without anyone realizing their true value. Few names inspire greater curiosity than Aristotle. Student of Plato, teacher of Alexander the Great, and one of history's most influential philosophers, Aristotle wrote on an astonishing range of subjects: ethics, politics, biology, astronomy, logic, poetry, rhetoric, physics, and metaphysics all became fields transformed by his observations. Yet, the surviving works represent only part of what he is believed to have written. Ancient catalogues suggest a far larger collection once existed. Several ancient writers refer to dialogues, essays, literary works, and philosophical treatises that no longer survive. These missing texts include titles known only by name, preserved in lists compiled centuries after Aristotle's lifetime. In some cases, later authors quote brief passages from books that have otherwise disappeared completely. These fleeting references hint at a library of ideas far greater than the one available today. The mystery begins shortly after Aristotle's death in 322 BC. According to one influential tradition, his personal library passed to his student Theophrastus, who succeeded him as head of the Lyceum in Athens. After Theophrastus died, the collection was reportedly inherited by Neleus of Skepsis, who carried the manuscripts away to Western Asia Minor. There, ancient accounts claim, the scrolls were hidden underground to protect them from collectors seeking valuable books for the royal library of Pergamon. If the story is true, the consequences were extraordinary. Hidden in damp conditions for many years, the manuscripts supposedly suffered severe damage before eventually resurfacing. They were later acquired, restored, copied, and transported back into wider circulation. Much of what survives from Aristotle today may trace its history through this remarkable chain of events. Yet, historians continue to debate nearly every part of the account. The story survives mainly through later writers such as Strabo and Plutarch, who recorded it centuries after the events themselves. Some scholars accept the tradition in broad outline, while others question whether such an important collection could truly have remained hidden for generations without leaving clearer evidence. The possibility exists that parts of the narrative were simplified, expanded, or reshaped over time. An equally important distinction often goes unnoticed. Many researchers believe the surviving Aristotelian works were primarily lecture notes or teaching materials rather than polished books intended for public readers. Ancient sources distinguish between Aristotle's exoteric writings, composed for wider audiences, and more technical works used within the Lyceum itself. Ironically, the writings praised most highly in antiquity, the elegant dialogues admired for their literary style, have almost entirely vanished, while many of the more specialized texts endured. Why those particular works disappeared remains uncertain. Perhaps they gradually fell out of circulation as educational priorities changed. Perhaps they were lost through ordinary neglect as fragile papyrus deteriorated over time. Fires, wars, floods, political upheaval, and the destruction of libraries undoubtedly claimed countless manuscripts throughout the ancient Mediterranean. Sometimes no conspiracy is required. Time alone can erase entire intellectual worlds. Still, speculation persists. Some imagine forgotten copies resting undiscovered within unopened tombs, buried villas, or hidden monastic collections waiting to be identified. Others wonder whether translations into lost languages once preserved ideas absent from surviving Greek manuscripts. Although no convincing evidence currently supports such hopes, remarkable manuscript discoveries have occurred before, reminding historians that the archaeological record remains incomplete. The disappearance of Aristotle's missing works represents more than the loss of individual books. It symbolizes entire conversations that ended before reaching the modern world. Unknown theories, observations, arguments, and questions may have vanished with them, leaving only occasional references scattered through later literature. What survives has profoundly shaped philosophy and science for more than 2,000 years. Yet, what was lost may have been equally extraordinary. Somewhere beyond the surviving pages, hidden among forgotten libraries and the silent ruins of antiquity, the unwritten chapter of Aristotle's legacy may still be waiting to emerge. If the disappearance of Aristotle's writings reminds us how knowledge can quietly slip beyond history's reach, another mystery concerns knowledge that was never fully understood in the first place. This time, the unanswered question is not what humanity forgot to preserve, but what invisible force brought one of the greatest cities of the ancient world to its knees. The narrow streets of ancient Athens shimmer beneath the summer heat. Stone houses crowd tightly together behind defensive walls, while smoke rises from cooking fires and thousands of anxious refugees fill every available space. Outside the city, the armies of Sparta move through the countryside, forcing farmers and villagers to abandon their homes. Inside the walls, people wait for safety that never truly arrives. Instead of swords or arrows, another enemy has already entered the city, one that no soldier can see. In 430 BC, only a year after the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, a devastating epidemic swept through Athens. The city had become dangerously overcrowded after the statesman Pericles ordered rural populations to shelter behind its fortifications rather than confront the Spartan army in open battle. The strategy protected Athens from immediate military defeat, but it also created ideal conditions for disease to spread among tens of thousands of people living in close quarters. The most detailed account comes from the historian Thucydides. Remarkably, he survived the epidemic himself. His description remains one of the earliest eyewitness records of a major outbreak in world history. Rather than attributing the disaster entirely to divine anger, he carefully documented its symptoms, hoping future generations might recognize the illness should it ever return. According to his account, victims often experienced sudden fever, inflamed eyes, severe throat irritation, violent coughing, vomiting, intense thirst, skin eruptions, and overwhelming exhaustion. Some died within days. Others survived only to suffer blindness, memory loss, or permanent physical damage. The disease spread rapidly through families, caregivers, and crowded neighborhoods, overwhelming every attempt at treatment. Even experienced physicians proved especially vulnerable. As they cared for the sick, many became infected themselves. Religious ceremonies offered little comfort, while traditional burial customs collapsed beneath the sheer number of deaths. Thucydides describes funeral pyres used by strangers, abandoned bodies awaiting burial, and a growing sense that ordinary rules no longer governed daily life. The epidemic attacked not only human bodies, but the social fabric of Athens itself. For centuries, scholars have debated one central question: what disease was it? The oldest explanation simply called it a plague, but the ancient Greek word used by Thucydides referred broadly to epidemic disease rather than the specific infection now known as bubonic plague. As medical knowledge expanded, researchers proposed numerous possibilities. One leading candidate is typhoid fever. In the early 21st century, researchers studying dental pulp from a mass burial associated with the epidemic identified DNA resembling Salmonella enterica cerevar typhi, the bacterium responsible for typhoid fever. The discovery attracted considerable attention because overcrowding and contaminated water could easily explain such an outbreak in wartime Athens. Yet, the evidence remains contested. Ancient DNA studies are technically challenging, and some specialists question whether contamination or degradation may have influenced the results. Others note that several symptoms described by Thucydides do not perfectly match modern cases of typhoid fever. As a result, the identification has not gained universal acceptance. Alternative diagnoses continue to compete. Some researchers favor epidemic typhus, spread by lice under crowded and unsanitary conditions. Others argue for smallpox, citing characteristic skin lesions. Measles has also been proposed because of its contagious nature and potential severity among populations lacking immunity. Viral hemorrhagic fevers have occasionally entered the discussion, inspired by descriptions of bleeding and rapid deterioration, although many historians consider such theories less likely given current evidence. Even combinations of diseases have been suggested. Athens during wartime presented ideal conditions for multiple infections to circulate simultaneously. Malnutrition, poor sanitation, contaminated water, and weakened immune systems could have allowed different illnesses to overlap, producing symptoms that appear confusing when viewed through modern medical categories. What Thucydides witnessed may not have been a single disease at all, but several epidemics unfolding together. The origins of the outbreak remain equally uncertain. Thucydides wrote that the illness traveled from regions south of Egypt before spreading through the eastern Mediterranean and eventually reaching Athens. Whether this reflected actual patterns of transmission or reports circulating at the time cannot be confirmed. Maritime trade connected distant ports with remarkable speed, allowing merchants, sailors, soldiers, and supplies to carry invisible pathogens across vast distances long before anyone understood how disease spread. Some later traditions interpreted the epidemic as divine punishment, linking it to broken oaths or the violence of war itself. Such explanations reflected the spiritual worldview of many ancient societies rather than medical investigation. Today, historians generally examine these accounts as evidence of how communities sought meaning during catastrophe rather than as literal descriptions of the disease's origin. The Peloponnesian plague altered the course of Greek history. It claimed the life of Pericles, weakened Athens at a critical moment in the war, and left lasting psychological scars upon those who survived. Yet, despite Thucydides' extraordinary observations and decades of modern scientific research, the precise identity of the epidemic continues to resist certainty. Somewhere within forgotten graves, microscopic traces preserved in ancient teeth, or evidence still hidden beneath the soil of Athens, may lie the final clue. Until then, the invisible enemy that transformed one of history's greatest cities remains as elusive as the countless lives it claimed. If the true cause of the Peloponnesian plague remains hidden within the silence of ancient graves, another mystery survives not in bones or ruins, but in words. Some of the greatest poems ever composed have endured for nearly 3,000 years, yet the identity of the voice behind them may have disappeared forever. The first rays of dawn spread across the Aegean Sea, painting the water in shades of gold and blue. Fishing boats drift quietly between scattered islands, while distant hills emerge from the morning mist. Along these coastlines, traveling singers once carried stories from village to village, performing before kings, merchants, and ordinary families gathered around evening fires. Their voices preserved memories of heroes, forgotten kingdoms, and legendary wars long before those tales were ever written onto parchment. Among those storytellers, one name stands above all others: Homer. For more than 2 millennia, he has been celebrated as the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, epic poems that shaped the foundations of Greek literature and influenced countless generations of writers, philosophers, and historians. These works introduced unforgettable figures such as Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, and Helen, blending heroism, tragedy, and human emotion into narratives that continue to resonate today. Yet, an extraordinary question remains: did Homer ever exist? Unlike many famous figures of antiquity, almost nothing can be established with certainty about his life. No contemporary biography survives. No inscription identifies him. No portrait created during his lifetime has ever been discovered. Even the century in which he supposedly lived remains uncertain, although many scholars place the composition of the epic sometime during the 8th century BC. Ancient traditions attempted to fill these gaps. Several Greek cities claimed Homer as their native son, including Smyrna, Chios, Colophon, and others scattered across the Aegean world. Each preserved local legends describing his birthplace, his travels, and his remarkable gift for poetry. Some stories portrayed him as a blind, wandering bard whose extraordinary memory compensated for the loss of sight. Others imagined him spending his life moving from one royal court to another, earning admiration through performance. The difficulty is that these traditions often contradict one another. They appear centuries after the period in which Homer supposedly lived, making it almost impossible to separate historical memory from cultural pride. Rather than preserving reliable biography, many scholars believe these stories reveal how deeply different communities wish to associate themselves with the creator of the epics. The poems themselves introduce another layer of mystery. The Iliad and the Odyssey contain remarkable consistency in language, style, and poetic structure. At first glance, this seems to support the idea of a single extraordinary author. Yet, they also preserve details drawn from different historical periods. Bronze Age weapons appear alongside customs associated with later centuries. Political institutions, social practices, and material culture sometimes seem to belong to different eras, woven together within the same narrative. This mixture has inspired one of literature's greatest debates. Known as the Homeric question, it asks whether the epics were truly composed by one individual or gradually assembled from generations of oral tradition. Before writing became widespread, professional singers known as aoidoi memorized and performed enormous bodies of poetry. They relied upon repeated phrases, familiar descriptions, and traditional formulas that allowed stories to evolve while maintaining recognizable structure. Many scholars argue that Homer, if he existed, inherited this living tradition rather than creating it from nothing. According to this view, he may have been an exceptional poet who transformed centuries of oral storytelling into masterpieces of unprecedented scale and artistic unity. Others suggest that multiple talented poets contributed to the epics over time, with later editors combining separate traditions into the versions known today. The development of oral formulaic theory during the 20th century strengthened this possibility. Researchers studying living oral poets in the Balkans observed how lengthy epics could be performed without written texts, constantly adapting while preserving their essential narrative. These discoveries demonstrated that monumental works like the Iliad could emerge naturally from oral cultures, challenging earlier assumptions about single authorship. More speculative ideas continue to circulate. Some propose that Homer was not a personal name at all but a title applied to master poets. Others imagine a school of storytellers working collaboratively across generations, their individual identities gradually merging into one legendary figure. A few even suggest that the epics underwent repeated revision long after their original composition, making the search for a single author ultimately impossible. Although these theories remain unproven, they reflect the extraordinary complexity of tracing literature back through centuries without written records. Archaeology has added fascinating context without solving the central mystery. Discoveries at sites associated with the Late Bronze Age, including the ruins traditionally linked to Troy, demonstrate that at least some elements of the poems reflect genuine memories of an earlier world. Whether those memories reached us through one remarkable poet or countless anonymous voices remains uncertain. Today, the name Homer stands at the beginning of Western literature, yet the person behind that name remains almost invisible. Was he a blind singer wandering the shores of the Aegean, a brilliant compiler of ancient traditions, a symbol representing generations of forgotten poets, or someone whose true story has simply been lost to time? Somewhere between legend, memory, and the enduring power of spoken words, the real Homer continues to wait, hidden behind the verses that made him immortal. If Homer's identity remains hidden behind poetry passed from one generation to the next, another mystery reaches even deeper into the foundations of the ancient Greek world. This time, the question is not who wrote a story, but whether the man credited with creating one of history's most disciplined societies ever lived at all. Morning mist hangs over the valley of the Eurotas River as the rugged peaks of the Taygetus Mountains cast long shadows across the plain. The remains of ancient Sparta appear almost deceptively quiet. Unlike Athens, with its towering temples and grand public monuments, Sparta left behind relatively few magnificent structures. Its greatest legacy was never carved into marble. It was written into discipline, military training, and an uncompromising way of life that shaped generations of warriors. At the center of that legacy stands a single figure: Lycurgus. For centuries, he has been remembered as the legendary lawgiver of Sparta, the man said to have transformed a divided kingdom into one of the most formidable states of the ancient world. Ancient writers credited him with creating Sparta's constitution, organizing its military system, redistributing land, establishing communal meals, reforming education, and laying the foundations for a society that valued duty above wealth and collective strength above individual ambition. Yet there is one remarkable problem. No one knows whether Lycurgus actually existed. Unlike later historical figures whose lives can be reconstructed through inscriptions, contemporary records, or archaeological evidence, Lycurgus stands at the edge of documented history. The earliest detailed accounts of his life were written centuries after the period in which he supposedly lived. By then, fact and legend had become so thoroughly intertwined that separating them has challenged historians ever since. Even the date of his life remains uncertain. Some ancient authors placed him in the 9th century BC. Others argued for the 8th century. A few suggested even earlier periods connected with the first Spartan kings. These disagreements are significant because they reveal that even educated Greeks of later centuries possessed no consistent historical memory of when Sparta's famous lawgiver had supposedly lived. The principal source for his biography comes from Plutarch, writing more than 700 years after Lycurgus' presumed lifetime. Plutarch himself openly admitted the difficulty of his task. At the beginning of his life of Lycurgus, he observed that almost every aspect of the lawgiver's story was disputed. His ancestry, his travels, his reforms, and even his death existed in multiple contradictory versions. Few ancient biographers began with such a remarkable acknowledgement of uncertainty. According to tradition, Lycurgus traveled widely before introducing his reforms. Some accounts claim he visited Crete, where he admired established legal institutions. Others suggest he journeyed through Asia Minor or even Egypt, studying foreign systems of government before returning to Sparta with new ideas. Whether these travels actually occurred remains impossible to determine, but they reflect an ancient belief that wisdom could be gathered through careful observation of distant cultures. The reforms attributed to him were extraordinary. Spartan citizens supposedly received equal allotments of land to reduce economic inequality. Gold and silver currency was discouraged in favor of cumbersome iron money, making the accumulation of wealth less attractive. Boys entered the rigorous agoge training system from childhood, learning discipline, endurance, and obedience above personal comfort. Adult male citizens shared simple communal meals rather than displaying private luxury. Military service became not merely an occupation, but the defining responsibility of every Spartan citizen. Taken together, these measures created one of antiquity's most distinctive societies. But did one individual truly design such an elaborate system? Many modern historians remain skeptical. Rather than emerging through the vision of a single lawgiver, Sparta's institutions may have developed gradually over generations in response to changing political and military circumstances. Social customs often evolve slowly, shaped by countless decisions rather than dramatic moments of reform. Under this interpretation, later Spartans may have attributed centuries of gradual development to a single legendary founder, because doing so offered a clear and authoritative explanation for their traditions. This phenomenon appears elsewhere in ancient history. Many civilizations remembered founding heroes who embodied collective achievements accumulated across long periods. Whether Romulus in Rome or Minos in Crete, legendary figures often served as symbolic origins for institutions that likely developed far more gradually than surviving traditions suggest. Yet, complete skepticism raises difficulties of its own. The remarkable consistency of Spartan customs over several centuries suggests that significant reforms may indeed have occurred at some point during the city's early development. Such dramatic changes could have required unusually capable leadership. Perhaps Lycurgus was a genuine historical figure whose accomplishments later expanded through legend. His actual role may have been smaller than tradition claims, yet substantial enough to leave a lasting impression upon collective memory. Another intriguing feature of the tradition concerns divine authority. Ancient accounts describe Lycurgus consulting the oracle at Delphi before implementing his reforms. The priestess reportedly declared his laws worthy of divine approval, strengthening their legitimacy among the Spartan people. Whether this consultation actually occurred cannot be verified, but it illustrates the close relationship between religion and political authority in the ancient world. Associating reforms with Apollo's oracle transformed human legislation into sacred obligation. Perhaps the most mysterious episode involves Lycurgus's disappearance. According to one famous story, after persuading the Spartans to swear they would preserve his laws until he returned, he voluntarily left the city and never came back. Some traditions claim he died in exile by his own choice, ensuring that the oath would remain binding forever. Others suggest he simply vanished from the historical record, leaving Sparta permanently committed to the system he had established. The symbolism is powerful. A lawgiver who removes himself from power becomes larger than any individual ruler. His absence allows the laws themselves to endure without challenge from personal ambition. Whether this story reflects historical reality or later literary invention remains uncertain, but its influence upon Spartan identity was profound. Archaeology provides only limited assistance. Excavations reveal the gradual emergence of Sparta as a significant regional power during the early Iron Age, but they have uncovered no inscription naming Lycurgus, no contemporary monument celebrating his reforms, and no definitive evidence confirming his existence. Instead, material discoveries reveal a society that evolved over time, leaving historians to decide whether that evolution resulted primarily from gradual adaptation or from decisive leadership now obscured by legend. More speculative theories continue to appear. Some researchers have proposed that Lycurgus represented not one individual but several early rulers whose achievements merged into a single legendary biography. Others suggest that later Spartan elites deliberately emphasized his story to justify institutions that had acquired authority through long tradition rather than original design. A few even wonder whether the historical Lycurgus, if he existed, introduced only a handful of reforms, with later generations attributing nearly every Spartan custom to his name. Today, visitors walking through the quiet ruins of Sparta encounter surprisingly little physical evidence of the society that once inspired admiration and fear across the Mediterranean. Yet, the mystery of its legendary founder remains remarkably alive. Was Lycurgus a visionary statesman whose reforms transformed an entire civilization, a partially remembered leader whose accomplishments grew with every generation, or a symbolic figure created to explain customs whose true origins had already been forgotten? Somewhere between archaeology, tradition, and the enduring memory of one of history's most disciplined societies, the answer continues to wait in silence. If the existence of Lycurgus remains uncertain because history preserved too few records, another mystery leads us to the resting place of a king whose influence changed the ancient world. This time, the silence does not surround a legendary lawgiver, but a royal tomb that may once have contained documents capable of reshaping our understanding of one of history's greatest empires. At the edge of the Murghab Plain, a solitary stone monument rises above the open landscape. Built from massive blocks of pale limestone, it stands upon a series of broad steps, its small, gabled chamber resting high above the earth. Wind moves quietly across the plains of Pasargadae, carrying little more than dust and distant birdsong. For more than 25 centuries, this simple yet imposing structure has watched empires rise and disappear, guarding secrets that may never be fully recovered. It is known as the tomb of Cyrus the Great. Unlike many royal monuments of the ancient world, the tomb is remarkably restrained. There are no towering reliefs celebrating military victories, no vast temple complex surrounding it, and no endless corridors decorated with elaborate carvings. Its quiet simplicity has fascinated travelers since antiquity, including Alexander the Great himself, who reportedly visited the tomb after conquering the Persian Empire. According to the historian Arrian, writing centuries later from earlier sources, Alexander ordered the tomb opened. Inside, he is said to have found the remains of Cyrus resting within a golden coffin. Rich garments, weapons, ornaments, and luxurious furnishings surrounded the burial. An inscription allegedly warned future visitors not to disturb the king, who had given them their empire. Yet Alexander was disturbed to discover that grave robbers had already entered the chamber, stealing many valuable objects while leaving the structure itself standing. This account has become one of antiquity's most enduring royal stories. But it also raises an intriguing question. If precious treasures were once stored inside the tomb, could something even more valuable have disappeared alongside them? Ancient royal burials occasionally contained written materials, although papyrus, parchment, and wax tablets rarely survive across millennia. Documents placed within sealed tombs occasionally endured under favorable conditions. Some historians have wondered whether Cyrus's burial may once have included personal correspondence, royal decrees, genealogical records, diplomatic agreements, or ceremonial texts now lost forever. There is no direct evidence that such records ever existed inside the tomb. Yet, the possibility continues to attract attention because so little survives from Cyrus's own reign. Despite founding one of history's largest empires, surprisingly few contemporary inscriptions can be confidently attributed to Cyrus himself. The famous Cyrus cylinder reveals aspects of his royal policy after the conquest of Babylon, emphasizing restoration and legitimate kingship. Beyond this remarkable artifact, however, much of what is known about Cyrus comes through later Persian traditions, Babylonian records, Greek historians, and archaeological discoveries scattered across different regions of the empire. His own voice remains remarkably faint. This absence has encouraged generations of historians to ask whether important royal archives simply disappeared over time. Some suggest that if documents accompanied Cyrus into his burial chamber, they may have been removed during the ancient robbery described in classical sources. To ordinary thieves, scrolls written on expensive materials might have appeared valuable because of their containers rather than their contents. Gold fittings, jeweled cases, or decorative boxes could easily have been taken while the manuscripts themselves were discarded or gradually decayed beyond recognition. Another possibility points elsewhere. The most important administrative records of the Achaemenid Empire were probably never intended for burial at all. Royal archives generally remained within palaces, government centers, or temple complexes where officials required continual access. If this was true in Cyrus' case, then the disappearance of early imperial records may have resulted from the destruction of administrative buildings through warfare, accidental fires, environmental decay, or simple neglect over succeeding centuries. The conquest of the Persian Empire by Alexander introduced another layer of uncertainty. Although Alexander admired Cyrus and reportedly ordered respect for his tomb, the empire itself underwent profound political transformation. Administrative centers changed hands, royal residences were abandoned or repurposed, and countless official documents may have been dispersed during the transition from Achaemenid to Macedonian rule. Organic writing materials rarely survive prolonged instability, particularly when preservation depends upon careful storage. Archaeology has revealed important evidence from Persepolis and other Persian sites, including thousands of clay administrative tablets recording taxation, labor, and economic activity. These discoveries demonstrate that the empire maintained highly organized record-keeping systems. Yet most surviving archives belong primarily to later reigns, especially those of Darius I and Xerxes. Materials dating directly to Cyrus remain comparatively scarce, leaving historians with significant gaps concerning the empire's earliest administration. This imbalance has inspired more speculative ideas. Some researchers have wondered whether unopened chambers still exist beneath or around the tomb itself. Modern archaeological surveys have identified surrounding structures within the royal complex, but no convincing evidence has revealed hidden vaults containing forgotten archives. Others imagine that records removed during ancient times entered private collections elsewhere in the empire before gradually disappearing through ordinary loss. While these possibilities cannot presently be confirmed, neither can they be entirely excluded given the fragmentary survival of ancient manuscripts. The inscription associated with the tomb presents another uncertainty. Greek writers recorded a version of its wording, yet no such inscription survives today. Was it destroyed by weather, removed deliberately, inaccurately remembered by later authors, or perhaps translated freely rather than quoted precisely? Even the message intended to greet visitors has become part of the larger mystery surrounding the monument. The tomb itself has survived remarkably well despite earthquakes, invasions, and changing dynasties. During the medieval period, local traditions even associated the monument with the biblical figure known as the Mother of Solomon, inadvertently helping preserve it through continued respect. Yet, preservation of the stone structure offers little guarantee that its original content survived with equal fortune. Today, visitors stand before the quiet monument at Pasargadae, much as Alexander is said to have done more than 2,000 years ago. The limestone walls reveal almost nothing about what once rested inside. Did Cyrus carry into eternity documents revealing the earliest vision of his empire? Were priceless records lost to grave robbers who never recognized their significance? Or did the true archives vanish elsewhere, scattered by conquest and time until only fragments remained? Somewhere between the silent tomb, the missing royal records, and the incomplete memory of one of history's greatest rulers lies a chapter of the ancient world that may still be waiting to be rediscovered. If the missing records of Cyrus the Great remind us that entire chapters of history can disappear without warning, another mystery emerges from an even greater silence. This time, the missing records belong not to one king or one empire, but to entire peoples whose identities faded almost completely from history, leaving behind only scattered names carved into stone. The waves roll steadily against the eastern Mediterranean coast as the sun sinks toward the horizon. Merchant ships once crossed these waters carrying copper from Cyprus, tin from distant lands, fine pottery from the Aegean, cedar from Lebanon, and grain from Egypt. For centuries, these sea routes connected some of the world's most sophisticated civilizations into a vast network of trade, diplomacy, and shared prosperity. Then, within only a few generations, that interconnected world began to unravel. Cities burned, kingdoms disappeared, palaces fell silent. Among the many mysteries surrounding the collapse of the Late Bronze Age, few have inspired as much debate as the identity of the people whom Egyptian inscriptions describe collectively as the Sea Peoples. The phrase itself is modern. Ancient Egyptian records never used a single unified name for these invaders. Instead, inscriptions from the reigns of Merneptah and Ramesses III list several different groups, including the Sherdon, Shekelesh, Peliset, Denyen, Jeker, Weshesh, Teresh, and others. Some appear in one inscription but not another. Some fought against Egypt. Others may have entered Egyptian service as mercenaries. Whether these names represented allied nations, independent tribes, migrating families, or temporary military coalitions remains uncertain. The most famous evidence comes from the temple walls of Medinet Habu. There, enormous carved reliefs depict fierce battles fought during the reign of Ramesses III around 1177 BC. Ships clash upon the sea while warriors wearing feathered headdresses advance beside ox carts carrying women and children. The imagery is striking because it portrays not merely an invading army, but entire communities apparently moving together. That single detail has shaped centuries of interpretation. Were these conquerors, refugees, settlers, or all three at once? According to the inscriptions, Ramesses III defeated these foreign groups after they devastated neighboring lands. The texts boast that powerful kingdoms had already fallen before the invaders reached Egypt. Although royal inscriptions naturally emphasize the pharaoh's triumph, archaeological evidence confirms that this period witnessed extraordinary upheaval throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The mighty Hittite Empire disappeared. Important cities such as Ugarit were destroyed. Trade networks collapsed. Long-distance diplomacy nearly ceased. Across Greece, many Mycenaean palace centers suffered destruction or abandonment. For generations, historians naturally connected these events into one dramatic narrative. The Sea Peoples became the mysterious force responsible for bringing down the Bronze Age world. Yet, modern research has complicated that picture considerably. Many scholars now believe the collapse resulted from several overlapping crises rather than a single invasion. Climate change may have reduced agricultural production across multiple regions. Prolonged drought could have triggered famine, migration, and political instability. Earthquakes damaged important settlements in some areas. Internal rebellions weakened established kingdoms. International trade, upon which many palace economies depended, became increasingly fragile. Against this backdrop, populations already struggling to survive may have begun moving in search of safer lands and better opportunities. If this interpretation is correct, the Sea Peoples may have been participants in a wider collapse rather than its sole cause. Their origins remain equally mysterious. One long-standing theory links several of these groups to the Aegean world. Similarities between certain names and locations mentioned in Greek tradition have encouraged comparisons. The Scherden have occasionally been connected with Sardinia. The Shekelesh have been associated by some scholars with Sicily. The Danaan have been compared with traditions concerning the Danaans remembered in Greek epic poetry. These similarities are intriguing, but they remain linguistic possibilities rather than established historical facts. The Peliset have attracted particular attention. Many historians identify them with the Philistines, whose settlements later appeared along the southern coast of Palestine. Archaeological discoveries reveal changes in pottery styles, architecture, and dietary practices in that region during the early Iron Age. Some of these features resemble elements found within the Mycenaean cultural sphere, suggesting at least partial connections with populations arriving from across the Mediterranean. Even here, however, certainty remains elusive. Material culture can spread through trade, migration, imitation, or intermarriage. Similar pottery does not necessarily prove common ancestry. Ancient identities were often fluid, especially during periods of widespread movement. The communities later known as Philistines may have included migrants from several different regions alongside local populations already living in Palestine. Egyptian art itself raises additional questions. The feathered helmets worn by several groups have become iconic symbols of the Sea Peoples. Yet, artistic conventions often simplified or standardized foreign appearances for visual clarity. Whether these depictions accurately represent clothing, ceremonial attire, or symbolic artistic choices cannot always be determined. Likewise, the ships shown in Egyptian reliefs provide valuable clues about naval technology, but reveal relatively little about the cultural identity of their crews. The names preserved in Egyptian inscriptions also resist easy interpretation. Some may represent ethnic groups. Others could describe political alliances. Still, others might simply reflect Egyptian attempts to pronounce unfamiliar foreign words. Without surviving texts written by the Sea Peoples themselves, historians must reconstruct their identities almost entirely through the observations of others. This absence is perhaps the greatest obstacle of all. Unlike Egypt, the Hittites, or Mesopotamian kingdoms, no archives confidently belonging to the Sea Peoples have ever been discovered. No royal inscriptions explain their motivations. No administrative tablets describe their governments. No historical chronicles preserve their own understanding of the dramatic events in which they participated. They remain visible only through the records of civilizations that encountered them. Some researchers therefore question whether the Sea Peoples should even be viewed as a single historical phenomenon. Instead, they may represent many unrelated populations whose movements happen to coincide during an era of extraordinary instability. Coastal raiders, displaced farmers, mercenary soldiers, traders unable to return home, and entire migrating communities could all have appeared along Mediterranean shores at roughly the same time. Egyptian officials, confronting unfamiliar groups arriving by sea, may have naturally described them together despite their diverse origins. Ancient literary traditions add another layer of complexity. Greek myths preserve stories of heroes wandering the Mediterranean after the Trojan War, founding new cities in distant lands. Although these legends cannot be read as straightforward history, some scholars have wondered whether they preserve faint cultural memories of population movements that followed the collapse of Mycenaean civilization. If so, later mythology may contain distant echoes of the same upheavals glimpsed in Egyptian inscriptions. More speculative theories have expanded even further. Some writers have proposed origins extending far into Western Europe or beyond the Mediterranean altogether. Others have suggested coordinated confederations stretching across enormous distances. While such ideas capture the imagination, current archaeological evidence provides little firm support for these broader reconstructions. Most specialists continue to favor explanations rooted within the interconnected societies of the Late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. Scientific techniques have begun offering new perspectives. Ancient DNA analysis, isotope studies, and improved archaeological dating continue to reshape understanding of migration during this period. Human remains recovered from several sites reveal surprisingly diverse ancestry, reminding researchers that ancient populations were often far more interconnected than once believed. Maritime trade had linked distant regions for centuries before the Bronze Age collapse, making mixed communities entirely plausible. Yet, these advances have solved surprisingly little. Each new discovery often complicates the picture rather than simplifying it. Instead of revealing one clearly defined people, the evidence increasingly points toward mobility, cultural interaction, and overlapping identities that resist modern categories. Perhaps that is the true lesson of the mystery. Modern observers often seek clear labels: one nation, one migration, one invasion. The ancient Mediterranean rarely operated so neatly. Alliances shifted, families relocated, mercenaries changed employers, traders became settlers, refugees became soldiers. Entire communities adapted to circumstances that transformed from one generation to the next. If the story of the Sea Peoples reminds us how entire civilizations can disappear into uncertainty, another mystery centers on a single night that transformed one of the ancient world's greatest cities into an enduring symbol of triumph, tragedy, and unanswered questions. It is a story preserved by historians, celebrated in legend, and still debated more than 2,000 years later. The first light of dawn touches the towering limestone columns of Persepolis, casting long shadows across broad ceremonial staircases carved with processions of nobles, soldiers, and emissaries from every corner of the Achaemenid Empire. Even in ruin, the city possesses an extraordinary stillness. Massive gateways stand open to an empty sky, while shattered capitals shaped like bulls and lions rest where magnificent palaces once overlooked the Persian plain. The silence feels almost deliberate, as though the stones themselves still remember the night when fire consumed one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. Persepolis was never an ordinary city. Founded by Darius I around 518 BC and expanded by Xerxes and later kings, it served as a ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire. Unlike Babylon or Susa, which functioned as administrative capitals throughout the year, Persepolis was a monumental expression of royal authority. During great festivals such as Nowruz, representatives from across the empire traveled there bearing gifts from distant provinces. Reliefs carved into the staircases depict these delegations with remarkable precision, each wearing distinctive clothing and carrying objects reflecting their homeland. The city represented something larger than government. It embodied the idea of empire itself. By the time Alexander the Great reached Persepolis in 330 BC, the Persian Empire had already suffered devastating defeats. Darius III was in retreat, and Macedonian forces had captured key royal centers across Western Asia. When Alexander entered Persepolis, he stood at the symbolic heart of an empire that had dominated the Near East for more than 2 centuries. Initially, his actions appeared surprisingly restrained. Ancient writers report that Alexander ordered the royal treasury secured rather than destroyed. The enormous wealth stored within the city became one of the greatest prizes of his campaign. Thousands of talents of gold and silver were carefully collected, requiring vast logistical efforts to transport them safely. Such deliberate organization hardly suggests the behavior of a commander intending immediate destruction. Then, everything changed. At some point after the city's capture, a fire broke out within the royal palace complex. By morning, much of Persepolis had been consumed. The event has puzzled historians ever since. The most famous explanation comes from Greek historians writing generations after Alexander's campaign. According to authors such as Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch, the fire began during an elaborate banquet celebrating the Macedonian victory. Wine flowed freely. Music echoed through the palace halls. Amid the festivities stood Thais, an Athenian companion associated with Alexander's court. According to the story, she reminded those present that the Persian king Xerxes had burned Athens more than a century earlier during his invasion of Greece. If Athens had suffered destruction, she argued, should not Persia's ceremonial capital experience the same fate? Inspired by drink and emotion, Alexander supposedly seized a torch and led a jubilant procession through the palace before casting flames into the royal buildings. Others followed, transforming celebration into catastrophe. It is a dramatic scene. It is also one that raises important questions. Could a commander renowned for strategic discipline truly destroy one of the richest cities in the world because of an impulsive decision made during a feast? Many historians remain unconvinced. Another ancient writer, Arrian, presents a more measured interpretation. Drawing upon sources generally considered closer to Alexander's military tradition, he suggests the destruction was intentional but strategic rather than accidental. According to this perspective, burning Persepolis served as a calculated political statement, announcing the definitive end of Achaemenid power. By destroying the ceremonial center of the Persian kings, Alexander demonstrated that the old imperial order had truly ended. This interpretation carries considerable weight. Throughout history, conquerors have often targeted symbolic centers of political authority. Destroying palaces, temples, or royal residences sends a message extending far beyond physical damage. It communicates that one system has fallen and another has taken its place. Yet another complication soon emerges. Not all of Persepolis burned. Modern archaeological excavations reveal that destruction was concentrated primarily within sections of the palace complex rather than the entire city. Some buildings escaped relatively intact. Administrative areas continued functioning for a time after the fire. This uneven pattern suggests deliberate selection rather than uncontrolled devastation sweeping indiscriminately across the site. Could Alexander have ordered only certain structures destroyed? If so, the event appears less like drunken chaos and more like carefully managed symbolism. The timing also deserves attention. By 330 BC, Alexander increasingly presented himself not merely as the conqueror of Persia, but as its legitimate successor. He retained many Persian officials, adopted elements of Persian royal ceremony, and gradually incorporated Persian nobles into his administration. If he genuinely intended to rule the empire rather than erase it, why would he deliberately destroy one of its greatest ceremonial capitals? This apparent contradiction has fueled debate for centuries. Some scholars propose that Alexander later regretted the decision. Ancient writers occasionally hint that reflection replaced celebration once the consequences became clear. If true, such regret suggests the fire may indeed have exceeded his original intentions. Others see no contradiction at all. Destroying Persepolis may have satisfied Macedonian and Greek expectations immediately after victory, while allowing Alexander to pursue reconciliation only after his authority became secure. Political leaders often balance competing audiences, and Alexander commanded not only newly conquered Persians, but also soldiers who had campaigned for years believing they were avenging earlier Persian invasions. The desire for revenge cannot be dismissed entirely. Greek memory preserved powerful stories about Xerxes' destruction of temples and public buildings during the invasion of Greece in 480 BC. Even after 150 years, those events remained central to Greek historical identity. Burning Persepolis could therefore be understood as a symbolic response completing a cycle of remembered conflict stretching across generations. Yet, Persian sources remain remarkably silent. Unlike Greek historians, surviving Persian records provide almost no detailed narrative describing the destruction itself. This absence creates one of the greatest challenges facing historians. Much of what is known comes through authors writing from the perspective of the conquerors, each bringing literary traditions, political assumptions, and cultural priorities that inevitably shaped their accounts. Archaeology offers valuable but incomplete evidence. Excavations reveal extensive fire damage across important palace structures. Burned wooden beams, collapsed roofs, and layers of ash confirm that intense fires occurred. Some stone surfaces display heat fractures consistent with prolonged burning. Yet archaeology alone cannot determine who ordered the fires or why they began. The palace archives introduce another fascinating dimension. Thousands of clay administrative tablets survived because the intense heat accidentally baked them into durable ceramic. Had the palaces not burned, many of these records might simply have disintegrated over time. Ironically, destruction preserved evidence that has transformed modern understanding of the Persian Empire's administration. The tablets reveal an organized bureaucracy managing workers, food distribution, livestock, travel permits, and regional resources. Rather than depicting an empire sustained solely through military power, they reveal remarkable administrative sophistication, involving men and women from diverse cultural backgrounds. Without the fire, much of this evidence might never have survived. Speculative interpretations naturally continue to emerge. Some researchers have wondered whether factions within Alexander's court encouraged the destruction to discourage reconciliation with Persian elites. Others suggest local resistance or accidental spread from smaller fires may have contributed more than ancient narratives admit. A few even question whether later Greek historians exaggerated the drama of the event to create a morally satisfying conclusion to the long conflict between Greece and Persia. None of these possibilities can presently be confirmed. What remains certain is that the destruction of Persepolis carried profound symbolic consequences. For Greeks, it represented victory over an old adversary. For Persians, it marked the disappearance of a ceremonial center associated with generations of kings. For Alexander himself, it may have represented both triumph and irreversible transformation, separating his identity as conqueror from his emerging role as ruler of a multinational empire. The physical ruins themselves continue to ask difficult questions. Why were some halls destroyed while others survived? Why did certain monumental sculptures remain standing despite intense fire? How much of the treasury had already been removed before the flames began? Were valuable objects deliberately evacuated, or did destruction interrupt an orderly process already underway? Each answer reveals another uncertainty waiting behind it. Perhaps the greatest mystery concerns intention. History often seeks clear motives: revenge, strategy, accident, political calculation. Human decisions, however, rarely arise from a single cause. Alexander may have acted under the influence of celebration while simultaneously recognizing political opportunity. He may have intended limited destruction that grew beyond expectation. He may even have viewed the burning as both personal vengeance and imperial symbolism without seeing any contradiction between the two. Ancient writers themselves struggled to define the event. Some portrayed Alexander as an impulsive young conqueror swept away by emotion. Others emphasized calculated statecraft. Still others balanced both images, presenting a leader whose extraordinary brilliance coexisted with moments of deeply human imperfection. Today, visitors walk among the towering columns of Persepolis, beneath the same open sky that overlooked the city more than 23 centuries ago. The carved delegations still ascend the great staircases in silent procession. The gateways still face the surrounding mountains. Yet the palace roofs are gone, their cedar beams reduced to memory by a fire whose true origin remains uncertain. Was Persepolis destroyed in drunken celebration, deliberate political theater, calculated revenge, unforeseen accident, or through a combination of motives impossible to separate after so many centuries? Somewhere among the scorched stones, the surviving inscriptions, and the voices of historians who never witnessed the flames themselves, the real story of that unforgettable night continues to flicker, refusing to disappear completely.